They said a man who controlled everything feared nothing, but Duke Cadric Ashford proved them wrong the night he stood alone in his own fortress with a loaded pistol pressed against his temple. The most powerful man in the Northern Territories, commander of armies, breaker of rival houses, reduced to trembling fingers and shallow breath in a locked study while his empire continued its ruthless machinery outside those walls. What breaks a man built from iron and cruelty? Not war, not betrayal. The answer was far more dangerous, and if you stay until the very end of this story, you'll understand why some obsessions don't save us. They just give us better reasons to destroy everything, including ourselves. The first crack in Cadric Ashford's armor appeared 3 weeks before anyone noticed he was bleeding. He sat at the head of an oak table scarred by decades of violent negotiations, surrounded by 12 men who owed their fortunes to his brutality and their survival to his mercy. The council chamber of Thornhaven Estate reeked of old leather, tobacco smoke, and the particular tension that emerged when wealthy men gathered to divide territories they'd stolen from weaker families. Candlelight threw shadows across Cadric's face, carving deeper the lines that 43 years of calculated violence had etched into his features. His hands rested flat on reports detailing grain yields, tax revenues, and the quiet disappearance of a merchant family who'd made the mistake of shorting his shipments. Lord Matthias Crane was talking, his voice carrying that particular blend of obsequiousness and barely concealed contempt that characterized most aristocratic discourse. Cadric wasn't listening. His attention had fractured somewhere between the second and third paragraph of Crane's presentation about tariff restructuring, his mind drifting toward the empty chair positioned near the southern window. She'd sat there during the last council meeting, her presence transforming the entire room's atmosphere without her speaking a single word. 24 days since she'd walked out of Thornhaven. 24 days of maintaining the fiction that nothing had changed. Cadric realized Crane had stopped talking. 12 pairs of eyes fixed on him with varying degrees of calculation. These men were predators themselves, capable of detecting weakness the way sharks sensed blood in water. He couldn't afford distraction. Not here. Not in front of advisors who'd replace him the moment they believed someone stronger could hold his position. Show them the monster they expect, and they'll never see the man underneath bleeding out. He leaned forward slightly, the movement drawing every gaze toward his face. When he spoke, his voice carried the flat, emotionless quality that preceded violence. Lord Crane, in the 17 minutes you've been talking, you've used the word prudent 9 times. You've suggested we show restraint with the river merchants. You've recommended patience with the Eastern trade guilds who've been skimming profits for 6 months. Crane's face went pale beneath his carefully groomed beard. The other council members shifted in their chairs, recognizing the particular tone that meant someone was about to be made an example. Your Grace, I merely meant to suggest... You meant to suggest I've gone soft. Cadric stood, his chair scraping against stone. He moved around the table with the unhurried pace of someone who knew his prey couldn't escape. You think because I haven't publicly executed anyone in 3 months, the Duke of Thornhaven has developed a conscience. You mistake exhaustion for mercy, Crane. That's a fatal category error. He stopped behind Crane's chair, placing one hand on the Lord's shoulder. The grip appeared almost friendly. Cadric felt the man's muscles lock beneath expensive fabric. Here's what's going to happen. Tomorrow morning, you'll visit the river merchants personally. You'll explain that their grace period has expired. Every coin they've stolen gets returned by sunset, or their boats burn with their families still aboard. No negotiations, no extensions. And Crane? Yes, Your Grace? If you use the word prudent in my presence again, I'll have your tongue removed and bronzed as a paperweight. Do we understand each other? Perfectly, Your Grace. Cadric returned to his seat, scanning the faces around him. Fear. Good. Fear kept men honest in ways honor never could. The meeting continued for another 90 minutes, each advisor more careful now, their proposals stripped of any suggestion that the Duke's legendary ruthlessness had softened. But beneath the performance, beneath the carefully maintained persona of the untouchable predator, Cadric felt something corroding his foundations, a weakness he couldn't name, couldn't acknowledge, couldn't cut out no matter how many enemies he destroyed or how many nights he spent alone in his study, convincing himself that emotional attachments were luxuries men like him couldn't afford. When the council finally dispersed, Kaedric remained seated while his advisors filed out with their leather portfolios and whispered calculations. The last man closed the heavy door, and silence flooded the chamber like water filling a tomb. He looked toward that empty chair again, remembering how she'd sat there during the grain shortage negotiations, her dark eyes tracking every lie, every manipulation, every moment of cruelty he'd deployed to keep his position secure. She'd looked at him afterward like she'd seen straight through to the hollowed-out core he kept hidden beneath layers of tactical brutality. "You're not cruel because you enjoy it," she'd said. "You're cruel because you're terrified of what happens if you stop." Kaedric stood abruptly, shoving the memory away. He had work to do, an empire to maintain, enemies to eliminate. The personal cost of power was irrelevant as long as the machinery continued functioning. He walked through Thornhaven's corridors with the measured pace of someone who owned every stone, every shadow, every breath of cold air circulating through the ancient fortress. Servants pressed themselves against walls as he passed, their eyes lowered in the particular submissive posture his household staff had perfected. He'd cultivated that fear deliberately, understanding that proximity to power was proximity to danger, and the only people who survived close to him were those who remembered that fact every waking moment. His private study occupied the fortress's eastern tower, accessible only through a series of locked doors that required keys only he possessed. The room reflected his aesthetic perfectly, functional, austere, designed to intimidate any visitor while providing him with absolute control. Maps covered one wall, each marking territories he controlled, rivals he'd crushed, alliances he'd forged through calculated violence. A weapons rack held firearms ranging from antique dueling pistols to modern military-grade rifles. His desk dominated the center space, its surface organized with obsessive precision. Kaedric poured himself whiskey from a crystal decanter, the amber liquid catching candlelight as he moved to the window. Thornhaven Estate sprawled beneath him, thousands of acres of wealth built on generations of Ashford ruthlessness. His father had taught him the fundamental truth of their world before dying of a stroke in this very room. Power was the only currency that mattered, and men who hesitated to take what they wanted ended up as footnotes in other men's victories. He'd built his entire existence on that principle. Every decision calculated, every relationship transactional, every emotional attachment surgically removed before it could compromise his judgment. For 43 years, that approach had worked perfectly, transforming him into one of the most feared men in the Northern Territories. Then Isla Thorn had arrived at Thornhaven 6 months ago, and everything he'd constructed started crumbling. The whiskey burned down his throat. He refilled the glass. She'd come as part of a diplomatic delegation from the coastal provinces, officially present to negotiate shipping agreements that would benefit both their regions. Kaedric had expected another performative exchange of proposals and counterproposals. The usual aristocratic theater where everyone pretended commerce wasn't just warfare by other means. What he hadn't expected was a woman who looked at him like she could see the machinery behind his eyes and found it fascinating rather than frightening. Their first conversation had occurred during a reception in Thornhaven's main hall, surrounded by politicians and merchants, all desperate to earn his favor or avoid his wrath. Isla had approached him directly, bypassing the usual social rituals that governed how lesser nobles communicated with someone of his status. She'd positioned herself between him and an escape route, her body language suggesting she had no intention of moving until he acknowledged her presence. Most women in aristocratic circles approached him with either calculated seduction or obvious terror. Isla had displayed neither. "I've been watching you," she'd said without preamble. "You're very good at making people believe you're invulnerable. Almost had me convinced until I noticed the way you position yourself near exits. Always tracking threats. Always calculating who in the room could actually hurt you." He'd stared at her with the flat, emotionless gaze that usually made people stumble through apologies. She'd stared back, unflinching. "You think you're the first person to recognize tactical awareness?" He'd responded. "Survival instinct doesn't make me vulnerable. It makes me effective." She'd smiled then, and something in that expression had bypassed every defense he'd spent decades constructing. "I didn't say it made you vulnerable," she'd replied. "I said it proved you're not invulnerable. There's a difference, Your Grace. Invulnerable men don't calculate exits. They don't track threats. They don't spend every social interaction performing dominance because they're terrified someone might see them as human." The conversation should have ended there. He should have destroyed her socially, politically, financially, demonstrated the cost of speaking to him with such casual disrespect. Instead, He'd done something he hadn't done in 20 years. He'd laughed. Not the calculated chuckle he deployed during negotiations or the cold amusement he showed when enemies begged for mercy. An actual laugh, startled out of him by someone who'd punctured his carefully maintained persona with surgical precision. They talked for 3 hours that night, long after the other guests had departed, seated in that same council chamber where he'd threatened Crane earlier. No audience, no performance. Just two people who'd both learned to weaponize intelligence and ruthlessness, discussing the particular loneliness that came with never being able to drop the armor. Isla had understood something fundamental about him that no one else had ever grasped. His cruelty wasn't innate. It was strategic, a tool he'd mastered because the world had taught him that kindness was just another word for weakness, and weakness invited destruction. But she'd also understood that spending your entire life performing invulnerability meant dying inside long before your body stopped functioning. Kedrick drained his third whiskey, his knuckles white around the crystal glass. The next 4 months had unfolded like a slow-motion catastrophe he couldn't prevent. Isla had remained at Thornhaven under various diplomatic pretexts. Her official duties requiring her presence while she and Kedrick conducted a relationship neither of them could afford, and both were too damaged to resist. They'd fallen into a pattern of late-night conversations in his study, discussions that started with political strategy and dissolved into something far more dangerous, actual honesty about the cost of the lives they'd chosen. She told him about growing up in a family where affection was transactional and survival meant learning to manipulate before you could be manipulated. About becoming exactly the kind of woman her environment demanded. Beautiful, intelligent, ruthless, while watching the parts of herself capable of genuine connection atrophy from disuse. He'd told her about his father's systematic destruction of any softness in his personality, the deliberate cultivation of brutality that had started when he was 6 years old and continued until he'd internalized the belief that emotional attachment was a design flaw in the human operating system. And somewhere in those conversations, something had shifted. The professional distance they'd maintained publicly began eroding in private. Physical proximity that started as coincidental became deliberate. Touches that could be dismissed as accidental lasted longer than they should. The careful walls they'd both constructed to protect themselves from precisely this kind of vulnerability began developing cracks neither could repair. The night she'd kissed him, Kedrick had experienced something he'd thought himself incapable of. Absolute terror unrelated to physical danger. Because he'd realized in that moment that Isla Thorne had become the single greatest threat to everything he'd built. Not through betrayal or political maneuvering, but through the simple fact that he'd started caring whether she lived or died, whether she stayed or left, whether she looked at him with affection or contempt. And men in his position couldn't afford to care about anything beyond maintaining power. A knock interrupted his spiral. Kedrick turned from the window, composing his expression into the mask of bored authority his household expected. "Come in." Marcus Varon entered, his military bearing evident in every movement. Kedrick's chief of security was one of 3 people in the world he trusted not to immediately betray him if offered sufficient incentive. That trust was still conditional, still tactical, but it existed in a way his relationships with most people didn't. "Your Grace, we've received word from the Southern Territories. Lord Garrett's family is moving against your supply lines. 3 shipments intercepted in the last week." Kedrick absorbed the information without visible reaction. Lord Garrett was a minor noble with major ambitions, the kind of enemy who needed to be crushed quickly before other vultures recognized weakness and joined the attack. Casualties? 2 of our men dead, 4 wounded. Garrett's people are being careful not to create incidents that would justify open retaliation. Smart, Kedrick acknowledged. He understands direct confrontation would be suicide, so he's probing for weakness through economic warfare. What assets does he have that we can leverage? Marcus consulted his notes, his voice flat and professional. Agricultural holdings in 3 provinces. A daughter being positioned for marriage into the Crane family. Debts to at least 6 major houses that he's been covering through increasingly desperate financial manipulation. Kedrick moved to his desk, his mind already constructing the tactical response. Standard methodology. Identify the target's vulnerabilities, apply pressure to multiple points simultaneously, force them into a position where surrender or destruction were the only options. Here's what we do. Approach his creditors quietly. Offer to purchase their debt at premium rates. Once we control his financial obligations, we call them due simultaneously. He'll be bankrupted within 48 hours. And if he tries to salvage the situation through the Crane marriage, we make sure Lord Crane understands that allying with Garrett means becoming our enemy. Crane's already on probation after his performance today. He'll abandon Garrett before risking his own position. Marcus nodded, making notes. Do you want Garrett eliminated after he's bankrupted, or should we allow him to survive as an example? It was a practical question, delivered without judgment. Marcus understood that Caedric's world operated on calculations of power and deterrence, not morality. Dead enemies couldn't betray you again, but broken enemies served as warnings to others considering similar challenges. Caedric started to respond with his usual calculation. Evaluate the strategic value of Garrett's continued existence versus the clarity of his elimination, when his mind offered an image of Isla's face. The morning after he had ordered the execution of a rival who'd been skimming profits from their shared ventures. You didn't even hesitate, she'd said, her voice carrying something between admiration and horror. He begged, had a family, offered you everything he owned, and you just nodded to Marcus like you were approving a dinner menu. He'd responded with his standard justification. Mercy was weakness, and weakness invited exploitation. If he showed compassion to one enemy, every other rival would recognize an exploitable vulnerability. She'd looked at him for a long moment before responding. You're not wrong. That's what makes it so horrifying. You've created a world where your logic is perfect and your humanity is irrelevant, and you don't even recognize what you've lost. Caedric realized Marcus was waiting for his answer. He forced Isla's voice out of his mind, returning to the practical requirements of maintaining his empire. Bankrupt him. Let him live as a warning. Dead martyrs inspire rebellion. Broken men inspire compliance. Marcus left with his instructions, and Caedric returned to the window, watching darkness settle over Thornhaven like a familiar enemy. The real fracture in his relationship with Isla had occurred 3 weeks ago, during a confrontation that had started with politics and ended with her walking out of his life. They'd been in his study, reviewing intelligence reports about a potential alliance with the Eastern merchant guilds. Routine work. The kind of strategic planning they'd done dozens of times before. But something had been building between them for weeks. A tension neither could name, but both could feel growing like pressure before a storm. She'd challenged one of his tactical decisions, suggesting he was being unnecessarily brutal in his approach to a minor territorial dispute. He'd responded with his standard logic. Overwhelming force prevented future challenges, and preventing future challenges saved lives in the long term. The argument had escalated from there. You keep saying you're being pragmatic, she'd said, her voice tight with controlled emotion. But I think you're just terrified that if you show an ounce of actual compassion, people will realize you're human and not some invincible monster. He'd felt something snap inside him, a defense mechanism triggered by the accuracy of her observation. You think I don't understand the cost of what I do? He'd shot back. I understand it perfectly. Every execution, every threat, every relationship I destroy to maintain power. I understand exactly what I am, Isla. I'm the monster this world requires, and I don't have the luxury of pretending otherwise. She'd stood then, her composure cracking for the first time since he'd met her. You're not the monster the world requires, Caedric. You're the monster you've convinced yourself you have to be because you're too terrified to try being anything else. And the tragedy is that you're so committed to this performance that you can't recognize the difference anymore. He'd wanted to hurt her then. Not physically, never physically, but with the surgical verbal precision he'd mastered over decades of destroying opponents through psychological warfare. Get out. The words had emerged flat, emotionless, carrying the weight of absolute dismissal. She'd stared at him for a long moment, her dark eyes searching his face for something he couldn't give her. Then she'd walked out of his study, out of Thornhaven, out of his life. 24 days ago. 24 days of maintaining the fiction that her absence didn't matter, that she'd been a temporary distraction from more important work, that he was perfectly capable of continuing his existence exactly as it had been before she'd arrived, and shattered his carefully constructed isolation. 24 days of slowly realizing that she'd been right about everything. Caedric opened his desk drawer, removing the loaded pistol he kept there. Not for suicide, not yet, but for the particular clarity that came from holding death as a physical object and recognizing how thin the line was between choosing to continue and choosing to stop. He pressed the barrel against his temple, feeling cold metal against skin. his finger resting near the trigger, not applying pressure, just acknowledging the option. This was what she'd seen in him from the beginning. A man so committed to performing invulnerability that he'd hollowed himself out in the process, replacing genuine emotion with tactical calculation until he couldn't remember what it felt like to want something beyond maintaining power. "You're dying inside, Kedrick," she'd told him during one of their late-night conversations. Successfully, efficiently, systematically, dying. And the worst part is that you've convinced yourself that's just the price of survival. He'd argued with her then, insisting that emotional connection was a vulnerability he couldn't afford, that caring about people made you exploitable, that the only way to survive in their world was to eliminate anything that could be used against you. She'd responded with a question that had been haunting him for weeks. What's the point of surviving if there's nothing left of you worth preserving? A knock at the door interrupted his spiral. Kedrick lowered the pistol, returning it to the drawer before calling for whoever was outside to enter. Marcus again, his expression suggesting something had changed in the 10 minutes since his last report. "Your Grace, we've received a message from the coastal provinces. Lady Isla Thorne has been taken by the Westgate Syndicate. They're demanding you withdraw your support from the shipping guilds in exchange for her safe return." The world stopped. Kedrick felt every defense mechanism he'd constructed slam into place simultaneously. The tactical analysis, the emotional suppression, the immediate calculation of strategic response. His voice emerged flat, emotionless, completely controlled. When? 3 hours ago. She was traveling between provinces under diplomatic protection. The Syndicate ambushed her convoy, killed her guards, took her alive. They want your answers by dawn, or they start sending pieces. How do we know she's alive? They included proof. Marcus placed a sealed envelope on the desk, his expression carefully neutral. Kedrick opened it with steady hands, removing a piece of parchment written in Isla's handwriting. The message was brief, characteristically direct. Still breathing. "Don't do anything stupid trying to be noble. You're not built for it." Even facing death, she couldn't resist challenging him. Kedrick read the note 3 times, his mind fracturing in directions he'd spent his entire life preventing. Because this was exactly the scenario he'd feared most. Someone he cared about being used as leverage against him. His emotional attachment transformed into exploitable weakness. The tactical response was obvious. Refuse the demands, eliminate the Syndicate leadership, demonstrate that taking his people was a fatal mistake, regardless of whether the hostage survived. It was the correct strategic choice, the decision that would preserve his reputation and prevent future attempts at similar leverage. It was also the choice that meant Isla died. Marcus waited silently, understanding that this was the kind of decision that required absolute clarity. No one else's input mattered. This was between Kedrick and whatever remained of his conscience. "Assemble the strike team," Kedrick said finally, his voice carrying no emotion whatsoever. "Full tactical gear. We move tonight." "Your Grace, if you're planning a rescue operation—" "I'm not planning a rescue operation," Kedrick interrupted. "I'm planning an extermination. The Westgate Syndicate has approximately 8 hours to exist as a functioning organization. After that, everyone involved in this abduction will be dead, their families will be dead, and their infrastructure will be burned to foundations." Marcus's expression didn't change, but something in his posture suggested he recognized this wasn't standard tactical retaliation. This was something far more dangerous. "And Lady Thorne, we extract her alive, or I kill everyone in the building until there's no one left to prevent her extraction. No negotiations, no demands, no mercy." "Understood, Your Grace." After Marcus left, Kedrick stood alone in his study, staring at Isla's note. The handwriting was steady, controlled, exactly what he'd expect from someone who'd spent their entire life maintaining composure under pressure. Still breathing. "Don't do anything stupid trying to be noble. You're not built for it." She still thought he was performing invulnerability. Still believed he was capable of choosing tactical advantage over emotional attachment. Still didn't understand that she'd already destroyed every defense mechanism he'd constructed, and he was about to prove it by burning down an entire criminal organization because they'd made the fatal mistake of threatening the only person who'd ever seen him as human. Kedrick removed the pistol from his drawer again, checking the ammunition with practiced efficiency. Then he began methodically arming himself. Knives, additional firearms, tactical gear designed for close-quarters combat, because 24 days ago, he'd chosen the performance over the person. He'd sent her away rather than admit that she'd been right about everything, that he was terrified of being vulnerable, that his cruelty was learned behavior rather than innate personality, that he'd spent so long performing the monster that he'd forgotten how to be anything else. Tonight, he was going to make a different choice. And if that choice got him killed, at least he'd die proving Isla wrong about one thing. He was absolutely built for nobility. He just needed someone worth being noble for. The strike team assembled in Thornhaven's armory at midnight, 12 men who'd followed Caedric into situations ranging from political warfare to actual combat. They understood their duke's reputation for calculated violence, for strategic brutality that served larger objectives. What they didn't understand was that tonight's mission had nothing to do with strategy. Caedric addressed them with the same flat, emotionless tone he used for every tactical briefing, outlining objectives and rules of engagement with clinical precision. But beneath the performance, beneath the carefully maintained mask of the invulnerable predator, something fundamental had shifted. He'd spent 43 years believing that caring about people made you weak, that emotional attachment was a design flaw, that the only way to survive was to eliminate anything that could be used against you. Isla had taught him something different. She'd taught him that surviving without anything worth protecting was just dying slowly. And Caedric Ashford was done dying. The convoy departed Thornhaven under darkness, heading toward the Westgate Syndicate's territory with enough firepower to start a small war. Caedric rode in silence, his mind methodically planning the violence he was about to deploy, calculating casualties and strategic approaches with the same precision he applied to every operation. But underneath the tactical thinking, underneath the performance of invulnerability, a single thought repeated with perfect clarity. 24 days ago, he'd chosen power over connection. Tonight, he was choosing differently, even if that choice destroyed everything he'd built, even if it proved she was wrong about him being capable of nobility, even if... Marcus's voice cut through his thoughts. Your Grace, we've received another message from the Syndicate. They've moved up their deadline. They want your answer now, or they start killing her. Caedric's hands didn't shake. His voice remained perfectly controlled. His expression showed nothing but cold calculation. But inside, in the hollowed-out space where his humanity used to exist before he'd systematically eliminated it, something cracked wide open. Tell them, he said quietly, they should have killed me instead, because the Westgate Syndicate had made one fatal tactical error. They'd assumed Duke Caedric Ashford's greatest weakness was caring about Isla Thorne. They hadn't realized that his greatest weakness was finally admitting it. And now everyone who'd touched her was about to discover exactly how dangerous a man became when he stopped pretending he had nothing left to lose. The convoy moved through darkness like a funeral procession for people who hadn't died yet. Caedric watched the landscape blur past armored windows, his reflection ghosting across bulletproof glass. A man who'd spent 43 years convincing himself that caring about anyone was just another form of suicide by installment. The irony wasn't lost on him. For decades, he'd eliminated every vulnerability, every emotional attachment, every soft place where someone could drive a knife. And the moment he'd finally let his guard down, the world had immediately confirmed every paranoid instinct he'd ever cultivated. Isla was right about one thing. He wasn't built for nobility, but he was built for violence. And right now, violence was the only language that mattered. Marcus sat across from him in the tactical vehicle, reviewing intelligence reports on handheld displays that cast blue light across his weathered face. The man had served Caedric for 12 years, long enough to recognize when his duke was about to do something that defied every strategic principle they'd established together. Your Grace, Marcus said without looking up, we're approaching this with overwhelming force. The Syndicate's compound is fortified, but their security is designed to prevent infiltration, not withstand direct assault. Estimated resistance is 40 to 50 armed personnel. We'll have numerical parity but superior equipment and training. Caedric absorbed the information mechanically, his mind already mapping entry points and kill zones. But beneath the tactical planning, something else operated, a cold fury that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with the fact that someone had touched what belonged to him. That thought stopped him cold. What belonged to him? That was the fundamental problem, wasn't it? The reason Isla had walked out 24 days ago. Because he'd never learned the difference between protecting something you valued and possessing something you couldn't bear to lose. In his world, love and ownership occupied the same category. You claimed what mattered before someone else could take it. You defended your territory with whatever force was necessary. And if people got hurt in the process, That was just the cost of maintaining what was yours. Isla had tried to explain the distinction to him during one of their last conversations, her voice carrying exhaustion that came from repeating the same argument too many times. You don't want a partner, Cedric. You want something you can lock in a vault and control completely. And the terrifying part is that you can't even see how that impulse destroys everything it touches. He'd responded with cold logic, explaining that in their world, unprotected things got taken or destroyed, and he refused to lose anything that mattered because he'd been too weak to claim it properly. She'd looked at him with something between pity and rage. Then I guess you're about to lose me, because I'm not interested in being claimed. 24 days ago, he'd let her walk away rather than admit she was right, rather than confront the fundamental truth that his entire approach to relationships was just another form of conquest disguised as protection. Now she was being held by people who understood exactly how to exploit the one weakness he'd tried so hard to eliminate. Your Grace, Marcus interrupted his thoughts, we need to discuss extraction protocols. If Lady Thorne is injured or compromised, standard procedures would require— We're not following standard procedures, Cedric cut him off. His voice emerged flat, emotionless, carrying the particular tone that meant the conversation was over. We extract her alive, or I burn the entire compound with everyone inside. Those are the only two options. Marcus met his eyes across the tactical display, recognition flashing in his expression. He'd seen Cedric deploy violence countless times, calculated, strategic, efficient. But this was different. This was personal, in a way that made standard operating procedures irrelevant. Understood, Your Grace. The convoy continued in silence, each vehicle loaded with men who'd killed for Cedric before and would do it again tonight without hesitation. They didn't need to understand his motivations. They just needed to follow orders and survive. Cedric returned his attention to the landscape outside, watching civilization gradually thin as they approached the industrial district where the Westgate Syndicate operated. These weren't sophisticated political enemies. They were criminals who'd gotten lucky, building a small empire through violence and extortion while more legitimate powers considered them beneath notice. Their fatal mistake had been assuming that taking Isla gave them leverage over him. They hadn't realized they'd just given him permission to stop pretending he was civilized. The tactical briefing occurred in a warehouse 3 blocks from the Syndicate's compound, surrounded by rusted machinery and the particular smell of industrial spaces that had been abandoned to decay. 12 men gathered around a holographic display showing the target location in precise detail. Entry points, guard rotations, structural vulnerabilities, everything Marcus's intelligence network had compiled in the 6 hours since Isla's abduction. Cedric stood at the head of the group, his presence commanding absolute attention without him needing to speak. These men understood hierarchy, they understood violence, and they understood that their Duke was about to order something that transcended normal tactical parameters. He outlined the operation with clinical precision, identifying primary and secondary objectives, rules of engagement, and extraction protocols. His voice carried no emotion, no indication that this was anything beyond standard enforcement action against a criminal organization that had crossed the wrong person. But everyone in the room understood this was personal. And personal operations were always the most dangerous, because they meant someone was fighting for something beyond strategic advantage. One of the younger operatives, Jensen, mid-20s, talented but still learning the difference between courage and stupidity, raised his hand with the particular hesitation of someone who wasn't sure if questions were permitted. Your Grace, if we encounter Lady Thorne during the assault and if she's been compromised or used as a shield, what are our protocols? The room went silent. It was a legitimate tactical question, the kind of scenario they needed to plan for. Hostage situations always complicated operations, especially when the hostage mattered to someone in command. Cedric looked at Jensen with the flat, emotionless gaze that usually preceded violence. But when he spoke, his voice carried absolute clarity. If Lady Thorne is used as a shield, you shoot through her to kill whoever's holding her. I'll deal with the consequences. The silence that followed felt like the room holding its breath, because what Cedric had just articulated was beyond ruthless. It was the kind of calculation that came from someone who'd decided that temporary harm to the person he cared about was acceptable if it meant eliminating the threat permanently. It was also completely insane, and everyone present knew it. Marcus cleared his throat, his voice carefully neutral. Your Grace, perhaps we should discuss alternative scenarios that don't involve— There are no alternative scenarios, Cedric interrupted. The Syndicate took her to create leverage. They're expecting me to hesitate, to negotiate, to choose her safety over tactical advantage. They're wrong. We go in fast, we eliminate every threat, and we extract her alive. Any approach that prioritizes her comfort over her survival gets people killed. It was the same logic he'd used for decades. Prioritize victory over sentiment, eliminate threats before they could compound, and never let emotional attachment compromise operational effectiveness. The logic that had built his empire and hollowed him out in the process. But beneath the tactical justification, Kaedric felt something else operating. A calculation that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with the fact that letting Isla see him hesitate, letting her witness him being weak for her sake, would destroy whatever fragile connection still existed between them. She'd told him 24 days ago that she wasn't interested in being claimed, that his compulsive need to control and protect everything he valued was just another form of violence. So tonight he'd prove her wrong by showing her exactly what he was. Someone capable of making the hard decisions she accused him of avoiding. Someone who could shoot through the person he cared about if that's what tactical necessity required. The fact that this logic was completely deranged didn't occur to him until much later. Marcus distributed final equipment checks and synchronized tactical communications, while Kaedric stood apart from the group, checking his weapons with practiced efficiency. 2 pistols, 1 knife, body armor that would stop most small arms fire. He'd been in combat situations before. Not often, because men in his position usually paid other people to do violence on their behalf, but enough to understand the mechanics of close-quarters warfare. Tonight would be different, though, because tonight he wasn't fighting to expand territory or eliminate business rivals. He was fighting to prove something to a woman who'd already walked away because she'd seen exactly who he was and decided she couldn't live with it. "Your Grace," Marcus approached him as the teams finished their preparations, his voice low enough that the others couldn't overhear. "I've served you for 12 years, followed your orders even when I disagreed with your methods. But I need to say this before we move." Kaedric looked at him, waiting. "What you're about to do tonight will either save Lady Thorne or destroy whatever remains of your relationship with her. There's no middle ground, and I'm not sure you've thought through which outcome you're actually pursuing." It was the kind of observation only someone with 12 years of proximity could make. The recognition. The Kaedric's tactical certainty was just camouflage for deeper confusion about what he actually wanted. Because the truth was that he didn't know if he was trying to save Isla or prove to himself that he was capable of the kind of decisive action she'd always accused him of avoiding. He didn't know if rescuing her would repair what had broken between them or just give her better reasons to leave. All he knew was that the thought of her dying while he calculated strategic advantages made him want to press that loaded pistol against his temple and pull the trigger just to stop the noise inside his head. "I've thought it through," Kaedric lied. "Let's move." The assault began at 0200 hours with synchronized breaches at 3 entry points. Tactical flashbangs shattered windows and disoriented security personnel, while Kaedric's teams poured into the compound with overwhelming firepower. The Syndicate's fortifications were designed to prevent subtle infiltration, not withstand military-grade assault. Within 90 seconds, the outer perimeter had collapsed completely. Kaedric moved through the chaos with absolute focus, his mind processing tactical information faster than conscious thought could follow. 3 hostiles down the left corridor. 2 more positioned near the stairwell. Security camera array destroyed. Internal communications jammed. Every element of the operation unfolding with mechanical precision. But underneath the tactical awareness, something else drove him forward. A desperation he couldn't acknowledge without compromising his effectiveness. Because admitting that he was terrified of finding Isla dead or broken would mean admitting that she'd been right about everything, that emotional attachment was a vulnerability he couldn't afford, that caring about someone gave the world permission to destroy you both. The Syndicate fought back with the particular viciousness of criminals who understood they were already dead and just wanted to take as many enemies with them as possible. Gunfire echoed through concrete corridors. Bodies fell. Blood sprayed across industrial walls. Kaedric killed 3 men in the first 2 minutes, his movements efficient and emotionless. These weren't people to him. They were just obstacles between him and Isla, problems that required permanent solutions. The tactical team secured the ground floor within 8 minutes, neutralizing or eliminating all resistance with practiced efficiency. Marcus coordinated movements through encrypted communications, directing teams toward the lower levels where intelligence suggested high-value targets would be held. "Your Grace, East Wing secure. 6 hostiles eliminated, 3 captured." No sign of Lady Thorne yet. Keep moving, Kedrick responded, his voice carrying no emotion despite the fact that his heart was trying to break through his rib cage. She'll be in the basement level. They'd want her isolated, somewhere they could control access. He moved toward the central stairwell with 2 operatives providing cover, his mind already calculating what condition he'd find her in. The syndicate specialized in kidnapping and extortion. They understood that hostages were more valuable alive than dead, but they also understood that damaged hostages provided better incentives for cooperation. If they'd hurt her, he forced the thought away. Emotion was a liability in combat situations. He needed to maintain tactical focus, process information efficiently, make decisions based on strategic advantage rather than personal attachment. All the logic that had served him perfectly for 43 years and had left him completely unprepared for the possibility that Isla might die before he could explain why he'd sent her away. The basement level was darker, colder, designed to disorient and intimidate. Kedrick's team swept through corridors lined with holding cells, most empty, some containing prisoners in various states of deterioration. The syndicate wasn't just in the kidnapping business. They were running a full operation of human trafficking, extortion, and disposal, which meant the likelihood that Isla was alive and unharmed was decreasing with every empty cell they cleared. Contact, one of his operatives reported through comms. 4 hostiles guarding a reinforced door at the end of the north corridor. They're dug in and refusing to surrender. Kedrick moved toward the location with Marcus flanking him, his mind processing the tactical reality. If the syndicate was making a stand at one specific location, it meant either Isla was behind that door or they were using it as bait to concentrate his forces for a counterattack. Either way, he was going through. The firefight lasted 40 seconds. 4 syndicate guards with automatic weapons versus 6 of Kedrick's operatives with superior training and equipment. The outcome was predetermined, but the guards made them earn it, forcing Kedrick's team to advance through sustained fire that left 1 operative wounded and 2 guards. Alive long enough to realize they'd made a catastrophic mistake choosing this particular employer. Kedrick executed both guards himself, 2 shots each at close range while they begged for mercy. He felt nothing. They'd been obstacles between him and the door, and now they weren't. Marcus approached the reinforced entrance, examining the locking mechanism while other operatives established security perimeter. The door was industrial grade, designed to withstand significant force. Breaking through would take time they might not have. "Your Grace," Marcus said quietly, "if she's behind this door and we breach loudly, anyone inside might—" "Breach it," Kedrick interrupted. His voice emerged flat, emotionless, completely controlled despite the fact that his hands were shaking and his heart was trying to tear itself out of his chest. "Whatever happens, breach it now." Marcus nodded, directing 2 operatives to position shaped charges against the locking mechanism. 30 seconds to set, 10 seconds to clear the area, 5 seconds to detonate. The explosion shattered the reinforced door and destroyed whatever remained of Kedrick's carefully maintained composure. Because beyond the smoke and debris, chained to an industrial support beam in the center of a concrete cell, was Isla Thorne, alive, conscious, and absolutely furious. She looked up as Kedrick entered through the destroyed doorway, her dark eyes tracking him with the same intense focus he remembered from their first conversation 6 months ago. Blood matted her hair on one side. Her wrists showed abrasions from restraints. Her clothing was torn in several places. But she was alive, and looking at him like she wanted to kill him herself. "You complete fucking idiot," she said, her voice hoarse but steady. "I told you not to do anything stupid trying to be noble." Kedrick crossed the space between them in 4 strides, his tactical awareness temporarily suspended by the overwhelming need to verify that she was real, that she was breathing, that the last 6 hours of controlled terror hadn't ended with him finding her corpse. He reached toward her face to check for injuries, to confirm she was solid and present, to do something with hands that suddenly didn't know their purpose. And she jerked away from his touch with enough force to rattle her chains. "Don't," she said coldly. "Don't you dare touch me like you're rescuing some damsel. I've been chained in a basement for 6 hours thinking about all the reasons I should have let you burn yourself out alone instead of trying to fix someone who doesn't want to be fixed." Marcus appeared in the doorway with bolt cutters, reading the situation with veteran instincts that told him this extraction was about to become significantly more complicated than the assault had been. He approached Isla carefully, avoiding eye contact with Kedrick while he worked on her restraints. "Lady Thorne," Marcus said with professional courtesy, "we need to get you out of here. The compound isn't fully secure yet, and— I'm fine, Isla interrupted, her eyes never leaving Kaedric's face. Your Duke just slaughtered 40 people because he can't stand the thought of someone taking what he considers his property. I'm sure the exit is perfectly safe now that he's murdered everyone between here and the street. Kaedric felt something crack inside him, not the clean break of something damaged beyond repair, but the slow fracture of something that had been under pressure so long it had forgotten what structural integrity felt like. Because she was right. About everything. About him being incapable of distinguishing between protection and possession. About his compulsive need to control and claim anything that mattered. About the fundamental truth that his love language was just violence directed at anyone who threatened what belonged to him. But she was also alive, and standing in front of him, and looking at him like she could see straight through to the hollowed-out core he'd spent 43 years trying to hide. I didn't come here because you're my property, he said quietly, his voice stripped of the usual tactical certainty. I came here because 6 hours ago, I realized I'd rather die trying to save you than survive having let you die alone. Isla stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she laughed, not the warm sound he remembered from their late-night conversations, but something bitter and exhausted. That's supposed to make this better? You finally admitting that you're capable of caring about someone so much it compromises your precious strategic advantage? Kaedric, you just proved every fear you've ever had about emotional attachment. You lost control. You made this personal. And now 40 people are dead because you couldn't handle the thought of losing something that mattered. She was right. The logical response was to acknowledge that fact, apologize for his methods, and work toward rebuilding trust through demonstrated behavioral change over an extended period. But Kaedric had spent 43 years being logical, and logic had left him alone in his study with a loaded pistol pressed against his temple, wondering what the point was of surviving if there was nothing left worth protecting. I'm not apologizing for killing people who took you, he said flatly. I'm not apologizing for making it personal. And I'm not apologizing for proving that I'm capable of losing control when someone threatens what matters to me. You told me 24 days ago that I was dying inside because I'd convinced myself that caring about anything made me weak. You were right, but you were also wrong about something. Isla's eyes narrowed. What was I wrong about? You said I wasn't built for nobility. Kaedric stepped closer, close enough that she could have hit him if she wanted to. But nobility isn't about making peaceful choices or showing restraint or pretending violence isn't sometimes the only answer. Nobility is about deciding what you're willing to burn for and then accepting the consequences without flinching. I burned an entire criminal organization tonight because they touched you. That doesn't make me noble, it makes me yours. The silence that followed felt like the world holding its breath. Marcus had quietly retreated to the doorway, giving them space for a conversation he absolutely did not want to be present for. The remaining operatives had established security perimeter and were carefully studying the walls, the floor, anything that wasn't the Duke and Lady Thorne having a relationship crisis over 40 fresh corpses. Isla looked at Kaedric with an expression that contained rage, exhaustion, and something else he couldn't identify. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but carried the weight of someone who'd spent 6 hours in chains thinking about exactly what to say. You're wrong about something too, she said. You think tonight proved you're capable of losing control. But it didn't. Everything you did was calculated. You assembled the perfect tactical team. You executed the operation with military precision. You even gave orders to shoot through me if necessary because you'd already decided that protecting me meant being willing to hurt me strategically. She stepped forward, closing the distance between them until they were inches apart. You didn't lose control tonight, Kaedric. You just found a new way to maintain it. And that's the problem, because I don't need you to murder people on my behalf or make grand gestures of possession disguised as rescue operations. I need you to be honest about the fact that you're terrified of being vulnerable and you're using violence as a substitute for actual emotional intimacy. Kaedric stared at her, his mind racing through tactical responses and strategic defenses. All the carefully constructed arguments he'd deployed for decades to avoid exactly this kind of confrontation with his own psychological architecture. And then he did something he hadn't done since his father died 15 years ago. He told the complete truth. You're right. I came here because I couldn't stand the thought of losing you, and the only way I know how to protect things that matter is to eliminate threats with overwhelming force. I killed 40 people tonight, not because it was tactically necessary, but because I needed to prove to myself that I was capable of choosing you over strategic advantage. And I gave orders to shoot through you if necessary, because I'd rather you hate me alive than forgive me dead. He took a breath, forcing himself to continue despite every instinct screaming that vulnerability was just another word for tactical disadvantage. I don't know how to do this, Isla. I don't know how to care about someone without turning it into conquest. I don't know how to protect someone without claiming ownership. And I don't know how to admit I need you without it sounding like I'm just describing another strategic asset. But you walked out 24 days ago because I chose maintaining control over admitting I was scared, and I'm not making that mistake twice. The silence stretched between them like a physical thing, fragile, dangerous, weighted with implications neither could fully articulate. Then Isla did something that surprised him completely. She kissed him, not gently, not romantically, with the particular violence of someone who'd spent 6 hours in chains deciding whether to forgive the man who'd put her there or kill him herself, and was still figuring out which option made more sense. When she pulled back, her eyes were wet, but her voice was steady. "If we're doing this," she said quietly, "if we're actually trying to make this work, you need to understand something fundamental. I'm not leaving because you're violent. I'm not leaving because you're ruthless. I'm not even leaving because you just slaughtered an entire organization on my behalf. I'm leaving if you can't figure out the difference between protecting me and possessing me." Kedrick looked at her, really looked at her, not through the tactical lens of what she represented or what losing her would cost, but at the actual human being who'd somehow seen past his carefully constructed defenses and decided he was worth the impossible effort of salvaging. "Then teach me," he said simply, "because I don't know the difference. And I'm tired of pretending I'm capable of figuring it out alone." Isla stared at him for a long moment, her expression shifting through emotions too complex to name. Then she laughed, exhausted, slightly hysterical, but genuine. "You just murdered 40 people, she said, "and somehow that's less terrifying than watching you admit you need help." Kedrick Ashford, Duke of Thornhaven, most feared man in the Northern Territories, asking for relationship advice in a basement full of corpses. "It does sound insane when you phrase it that way," Kedrick admitted. Marcus cleared his throat from the doorway, his voice carefully neutral. "Your Grace, Lady Thorn, we need to extract before local authorities respond. We've neutralized immediate threats, but this compound will draw significant attention shortly." Isla looked at Kedrick, her eyes searching his face for something he hoped was actually there. Then she nodded once. "Decision made. Get me out of here," she said. "And then you and I are going to have a very long conversation about boundaries, consent, and the fact that I'm not interested in being your project or your possession." "Understood," Kedrick said. "And Kedrick?" "Yes?" "If you ever order someone to shoot through me again, I will kill you myself, slowly. Are we clear?" "Completely clear." They exited the compound through smoke and debris, past bodies that would require extensive cleanup and explanations that Kedrick's political connections would need to manufacture. The tactical team extracted efficiently, loading into armored vehicles that disappeared into darkness before emergency services arrived. Kedrick sat beside Isla in the lead vehicle, close enough to touch, but maintaining careful distance, while Marcus coordinated their return to Thornhaven. Neither spoke for the first 20 minutes, the silence heavy with implications neither was ready to articulate. Finally, Isla broke the quiet. "What happens now?" Kedrick considered the question, not tactically, not strategically, but with actual honest evaluation of what came next. Because tonight had changed something fundamental, not through the violence or the rescue operation, but through his admission in that concrete cell that he didn't know how to care about someone without turning it into another form of control. "Now," he said slowly, "we go back to Thornhaven. We deal with the political fallout from tonight. And then you teach me how to be in a relationship without treating it like hostile territory acquisition." Isla looked at him with an expression that contained equal parts exhaustion and something that might have been hope. "That's a lot of work for someone who spent the last 24 days convinced you were better off alone." "I was wrong," Kedrick said simply, "about a lot of things, but mostly about thinking that surviving alone was better than risking connection." They sat in silence for another mile before Isla reached over and took his hand, not romantically, not with any particular gentleness, just acknowledging that they were both present and trying despite having no idea if this would work or just give them better reasons to hurt each other. Kedrick looked down at their joined hands, feeling something unfamiliar work its way through his carefully constructed defenses. Not the tactical calculation of strategic advantage, not the cold assessment of cost-benefit ratios, Just the simple recognition that he'd rather fail trying to build something real with her than succeed at maintaining the empty fortress he'd spent 43 years constructing. Outside the armored windows, darkness gradually gave way to dawn. Thornhaven Estate appeared on the horizon like a monument to everything he'd built and everything he'd destroyed in the process. Behind them, the Westgate Syndicate compound burned. Ahead, uncertainty. And for the first time in his life, Cadric Ashford chose the uncertainty, even if it killed him, especially if it killed him. Because dying while trying to build something real was infinitely preferable to surviving alone in a fortress designed to keep everyone out, including the parts of himself still capable of being human. The convoy passed through Thornhaven's gates as morning light broke across the northern territories, and Cadric realized with perfect clarity that tonight hadn't been about rescue or redemption. It had been about reaching the point where turning back was impossible, and whatever came next would determine whether that impossible choice destroyed them both or gave them something worth the cost of actually trying. Dawn broke over Thornhaven like an accusation, cold light exposing every crack in the fortress walls that Cadric had spent decades convincing himself were impenetrable. He stood in his study watching the sun crawl across his territory while Isla slept in the guest quarters 3 floors below, her presence in his home feeling simultaneously necessary and dangerous. Like keeping a loaded weapon you weren't sure how to hold without it going off in your hands. The political fallout from the Westgate Syndicate massacre had started before the bodies were cold. 3 council members had requested emergency meetings. 7 rival houses had sent carefully worded inquiries about the Duke's recent activities. And the Crown itself had dispatched an official investigator to determine whether Cadric's assault on a criminal organization constituted justifiable enforcement or unauthorized military action that threatened regional stability. None of that concerned him as much as the message Marcus had delivered 20 minutes ago, sealed in an envelope that still sat unopened on his desk like a live grenade. Intelligence suggesting someone inside Thornhaven had provided the Westgate Syndicate with Isla's travel schedule and security protocols. Someone with access to information that should have been restricted to his inner circle, which meant someone he trusted had sold him out. Cadric picked up the envelope, his fingers steady despite the fact that his entire operational framework was built on the assumption that loyalty could be purchased through fear and reward in carefully calibrated proportions. The idea that someone close enough to access classified information would risk betraying him suggested either stupidity or desperation, and desperate people made catastrophic decisions. He opened the envelope, extracting 3 pages of intelligence reports compiled by Marcus's security team. Names, communication intercepts, financial transactions that traced back to accounts connected with the syndicate's leadership. The evidence was thorough, methodical, and pointed directly at someone Cadric had trusted for 8 years. Lord Adrian Voss, his senior political advisor and one of 3 people who'd had access to Isla's itinerary. The man who'd sat in Cadric's council meetings offering strategic guidance, who'd negotiated treaties on Thornhaven's behalf, who'd been present during at least 24 conversations where Cadric had discussed his relationship with Isla in terms that made his vulnerability obvious to anyone paying attention. Cadric read through the evidence twice, his mind processing implications with mechanical precision while something deeper fractured. Because this wasn't just political betrayal. This was personal. Someone had looked at his carefully guarded weakness, his attachment to Isla, and decided it was exploitable. Had collaborated with criminals to kidnap the one person capable of getting past his defenses, knowing it would either break him or force him into exactly the kind of violent overreaction that would destabilize his political position. The really devastating part was recognizing that the strategy had nearly worked perfectly. He'd burned an entire criminal organization, murdered 40 people, and compromised his reputation as a tactically rational operator because someone had correctly identified that Isla Thorn was the single point of failure in his otherwise impenetrable psychological architecture. A knock interrupted his analysis. Marcus entered without waiting for permission, his expression suggesting he'd been awake as long as Cadric had and had reached similarly grim conclusions. Your Grace, Voss is requesting an emergency council meeting, says there's urgent business regarding the Crown's investigation into last night's activities. Of course he is, Cadric said quietly. He wants to position himself publicly before I can move against him privately. Smart. Almost makes me respect the strategy. Marcus closed the door. his voice dropping to the particular register that meant they were discussing matters that couldn't be overheard even by trusted household staff. What do you want to do? Kedrick considered the question with the same tactical precision he'd applied to every problem for 43 years. The logical response was clear. Isolate Voss, extract a confession through whatever methods were necessary, eliminate him quietly, and use his death as a warning to anyone else considering similar betrayals. Clean, efficient, strategically sound. Also exactly the kind of decision that would prove Ela right about him being incapable of responding to conflict without defaulting to violence. Call the council meeting, Kedrick said finally. Full attendance. I want everyone present when I deal with this. Marcus's expression shifted slightly, recognition flashing across his weathered features. Your Grace, if you're planning to confront Voss publicly, I'm planning to demonstrate that betraying me has consequences, Kedrick interrupted. Whether those consequences include his death depends entirely on how he responds to being exposed. It was a compromise between his tactical instincts and Isla's insistence that he find ways to resolve conflicts without immediately reaching for lethal solutions. He wasn't sure it was the right approach. He wasn't sure it would work, but he was sure that repeating the same patterns that had left him alone in his study with a loaded pistol wasn't sustainable long-term. The council chamber filled gradually over the next 2 hours. 12 men who governed Thornhaven's territories under Kedrick's authority, gathering with the particular wariness that came from knowing their duke had just murdered 40 people and was probably not in a forgiving mood. They took their positions around the scarred oak table, their expressions carefully neutral, while undercurrents of calculation ran beneath every polite exchange. Lord Voss arrived last, his timing deliberate, late enough to make an entrance, early enough to avoid obvious disrespect. He was a handsome man in his late 40s, the kind of aristocrat who'd mastered the art of appearing trustworthy while concealing ruthless ambition behind practiced charm. He'd served Kedrick faithfully for 8 years, or at least had maintained that performance convincingly enough that Kedrick had trusted him with increasingly sensitive information. The realization that he'd been wrong about Voss's loyalty hit harder than it should have, because Kedrick had built his entire operational model on the assumption that he was skilled enough at reading people to identify threats before they materialized. Being blindsided by someone this close suggested his judgment was compromised in ways he couldn't afford. Your Grace, Voss began, his voice carrying practiced deference. I've requested this emergency session because the Crown's investigator will arrive this afternoon. We need to coordinate our response to questions about last night's operation against the Westgate Syndicate. The political implications are significant, and we're not here to discuss the Crown's investigation, Kedrick interrupted, his voice flat and emotionless. We're here to discuss how the Syndicate obtained classified information about Lady Thorne's security protocols. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Every council member went perfectly still, recognizing the particular tone that preceded violence. Voss's expression remained carefully composed, but something flickered behind his eyes. Calculation. Fear, or both. Your Grace, I'm not sure I understand what you're implying. Kedrick placed the intelligence reports on the table between them, his movements deliberate and unhurried. I'm not implying anything. Adrian, I'm stating facts. Someone with access to restricted information provided the Syndicate with Lady Thorne's itinerary, security details, and vulnerability assessments. That someone made 40,000 gold from the transaction, and that someone was you. The silence that followed felt like the room holding its breath. The other council members exchanged glances, already calculating how Voss's exposure would affect their own positions, whether his fall created opportunities for advancement or suggested increased scrutiny of their own activities. Voss looked at the reports without touching them, his composure fracturing at the edges. Your Grace, these accusations are supported by financial records, communication intercepts, and testimony from 3 syndicate members we captured last night, Kedrick continued, one of whom identified you specifically as their source inside Thornhaven. So before you waste time denying the obvious, let me be very clear about your current situation. You betrayed me. You collaborated with criminals to kidnap someone under my protection, and you're about to experience consequences. Voss's mask dropped completely. His expression shifted from practiced deference to something raw, desperation mixed with rage at being caught. When he spoke, his voice carried the particular venom of someone who'd spent years resenting the man he'd pretended to serve. You want to talk about betrayal, Your Grace? You've spent 8 years treating this council like servants, making decisions without consultation, threatening anyone who questions your methods. You're not a duke, Kedrick. You're a tyrant who's convinced himself that brutality equals strength. And yes, I helped the syndicate take your precious Lady Thorn because someone needed to demonstrate that you're not as invulnerable as you pretend. The room went absolutely silent, because what Voss had just articulated was more than confession. It was declaration of war. An acknowledgement that his betrayal wasn't opportunistic but ideological, rooted in genuine belief that Kedrick's leadership was destructive and needed to be challenged. It was also stupidly honest, and honesty in situations like this usually meant the speaker had already accepted they were dead. Kedrick stood slowly, his movements controlled and deliberate despite the fact that something inside him was screaming for immediate violence. Every instinct he'd cultivated over 43 years demanded he reach across the table and kill Voss with his bare hands, demonstrating to everyone present that betrayal had swift and permanent consequences. But Isla's voice echoed in his memory, exhausted and furious in that concrete cell. I need you to be honest about the fact that you're terrified of being vulnerable and you're using violence as a substitute for actual emotional intimacy. He'd promised to try being different, to find ways of resolving conflict that didn't default to elimination, to prove that he was capable of responding to threats without immediately reaching for lethal solutions. This was that test, and he was fairly certain he was about to fail it. You're right about something, Kedrick said quietly, his voice stripped of tactical certainty. I have spent 8 years ruling through fear and intimidation. I've treated loyalty as a transaction and punished dissent with violence. And I've convinced myself that this approach was necessary because showing weakness invited destruction. He looked around the table at 11 men who were watching this exchange with the fascinated horror of people witnessing their predator admit vulnerability. But you're wrong about why I'm going to destroy you, Adrian. I'm not going to destroy you because you challenged my authority or questioned my methods, or even because you collaborated with criminals. I'm going to destroy you because you used my attachment to Isla as a weapon, and that crosses a line I didn't even know existed until 6 hours ago when I realized I'd rather die than lose her. Voss laughed. Sharp, bitter, unhinged. You think that makes you better? You think admitting you're obsessed with one woman somehow justifies everything else? You're exactly what I said you are. Kedrick, a tyrant who's found a new excuse for violence. Maybe, Kedrick acknowledged, but here's the difference between tonight and every other time I've eliminated a threat. I'm going to give you a choice. The room went absolutely still, because Kedrick Ashford didn't give choices. He made decisions and enforced them with overwhelming force. The concept of offering options to someone who'd betrayed him was so unprecedented that several council members looked genuinely confused about whether this was tactical misdirection or actual mercy. You can stand trial, Kedrick continued. Public proceedings. Full disclosure of your crimes. The Crown's investigators will have access to all evidence. Your family name will be destroyed, your assets seized, and you'll likely spend the rest of your life in a cell. But you'll live. He paused, letting that option settle before presenting the alternative. Or you can accept exile. You leave Thornhaven tonight with whatever you can carry. No assets, no titles, no protection. You disappear completely and never return. And in exchange, your family's reputation remains intact, and your children don't inherit the consequences of your decisions. Voss stared at him like he'd started speaking a foreign language. You're offering me exile? After I tried to have your woman killed? I'm offering you a choice, Kedrick corrected. Because the woman you tried to have killed spent 6 hours teaching me that responding to every conflict with maximum violence is just another form of weakness. And I'm tired of being weak. The silence that followed was absolute. Every person in the room understood they were witnessing something unprecedented, not mercy exactly, but a fundamental shift in how Kedrick Ashford calculated consequences. The Duke of Thornhaven, most feared man in the Northern Territories, offering exile to a traitor instead of immediate execution. It was either evolution or weakness, and no one present was sure which. Voss looked at Kedrick for a long moment, something working behind his eyes that might have been respect or might have been contempt. Then he stood, his movements stiff and formal. I'll take exile, he said quietly. Not because I believe you've changed, but because I recognize tactical advantage when it's offered. You want to prove you're capable of mercy? Fine, but don't expect me to be grateful. I don't expect gratitude, Kedrick responded. I expect you to disappear before I change my mind. Marcus escorted Voss from the chamber while the remaining council members sat in stunned silence, processing what they'd just witnessed. Kedrick returned to his seat at the head of the table, his hands steady, despite the fact that every tactical instinct he possessed was screaming that he'd just made a catastrophic mistake. Because offering exile to a traitor didn't demonstrate strength, it demonstrated exploitable weakness. And the moment his enemies recognized that weakness, they'd test it in ways that would force him to either abandon his principles or watch his empire collapse. He looked around the table at 11 men who were all recalculating their assessments of his capabilities, trying to determine whether this represented actual change or temporary insanity brought on by attachment to a woman. "Let me be very clear about something," Kedrick said, his voice carrying absolute authority despite the doubt screaming inside his head. "What you just witnessed was not weakness. It was strategic restraint. Adrian Voss betrayed me, and I could have killed him. Instead, I chose exile because I'm tired of ruling through fear alone. But make no mistake, if any of you interpret this decision as invitation to test my resolve, I will demonstrate that restraint has limits." He stood, ending the meeting with the same abrupt dismissal he'd used for 8 years. "That's all. Get back to work." The council dispersed quickly, leaving Kedrick alone in the chamber where he'd threatened Crane what felt like a lifetime ago, but was actually less than 24 hours. He stayed seated, staring at the empty chair where Isla had sat during that grain shortage negotiation 6 months ago, wondering if she'd be proud of his decision or horrified that he'd struggled so hard with something that should have been obvious. The door opened without warning. Isla entered like she owned the space, her movements carrying the same confidence he remembered despite the visible bruising on her wrists and the exhaustion evident in her posture. She'd clearly been listening to the council meeting from somewhere nearby, probably with Marcus's complicit permission. She sat in her usual chair without asking, her dark eyes fixed on him with that unnerving intensity that suggested she could see straight through his tactical calculations to the confused mess underneath. "You offered him exile," she said. "Not a question. An observation." "I offered him exile," Kedrick confirmed. His voice sounded tired even to himself, despite every tactical instinct telling me it was weakness. Despite knowing it compromises my reputation for ruthless enforcement. Because you told me I needed to find ways of resolving conflict without defaulting to violence, and I'm trying to be someone capable of that." Isla studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "And how do you feel about that decision now?" "Like I just gave my enemies permission to test whether I've gone soft," Kedrick admitted. "Like I compromised operational security because I was more concerned about proving something to you than maintaining strategic advantage. Like I'm betraying everything my father taught me about power, requiring absolute commitment to eliminating threats permanently." He looked at her directly, letting her see the doubt he'd spent 43 years hiding. "So either I've evolved into someone capable of measured responses, or I've become exactly what Voss accused me of being, a tyrant who's found new excuses for compromised judgment, and I genuinely don't know which." Isla leaned back in her chair, something shifting in her expression that might have been approval or disappointment or both. "You want me to tell you that offering exile was right, that showing restraint proves you're changing, that I'm proud of you for choosing a non-violent solution." "I want you to tell me the truth," Kedrick said quietly. "The truth is that I have no idea if what you did was right," Isla responded. "Maybe offering exile to a traitor demonstrates emotional maturity. Maybe it demonstrates compromised judgment. Maybe it's both simultaneously. But here's what I do know. You made a choice that contradicted every instinct you've cultivated for 43 years because you thought it might matter to me. 43 smaltet. That doesn't make you weak, Kedrick. It makes you terrifying in completely new ways." She stood, moving around the table until she was close enough to touch, but maintaining careful distance. Because a man who kills his enemies is predictable. A man who offers them mercy, that man is either evolving or collapsing, and no one can tell the difference until it's too late. So congratulations, Your Grace. You've traded certainty for ambiguity, and now we both get to find out whether that was wisdom or suicide. Before Kedrick could respond, Marcus burst through the door with the particular urgency that meant something had gone catastrophically wrong. His expression carried the kind of controlled panic that came from career soldiers who'd seen genuinely bad situations and recognized when they were about to get worse. "Your Grace, we have a problem." Kedrick stood, his tactical awareness snapping back into place despite the emotional exhaustion. "What kind of problem?" "The kind that suggests Voss wasn't working alone." Marcus placed a tablet on the table, its screen showing security footage from Thornhaven's eastern perimeter. 3 figures approaching through the pre-dawn darkness. Military bearing, professional equipment, and carrying authorization codes that should have been restricted to Kaedric's inner circle. Someone just breached our security with credentials that came from inside this fortress. They're heading directly toward the guest quarters where Lady Thorn was sleeping 2 hours ago, and they've got enough firepower to level that entire wing. Ela went perfectly still, her expression shifting from exhausted amusement to tactical awareness faster than most trained operatives could manage. How many? 3 confirmed, Marcus reported. Possibly more. And before you ask, yes, I've already evacuated the guest wing and established defensive perimeter. But whoever sent them knew exactly where to look and exactly when our security rotations would create vulnerability. Which means someone on your current council is still compromised, Isla said quietly, her voice carrying absolute certainty. Voss might have been your betrayer, but he wasn't your only one. Kaedric felt something cold settle into his chest, the recognition that his decision to show mercy had been exploited before the exile was even complete. That offering Voss a choice hadn't been evolution or wisdom, but exactly what his tactical instincts had warned him it was. Exploitable weakness that his enemies had immediately recognized and capitalized on. He'd tried being different, tried choosing restraint over violence, tried proving he was capable of measured responses, and the world had immediately punished him for it. Lock down the entire estate, Kaedric said, his voice returning to the flat, emotionless tone that preceded systematic violence. No one enters or leaves without my direct authorization. I want every council member detained and interrogated. Someone in that room is coordinating with whoever's trying to kill Isla, and they have approximately 10 minutes to confess before I stop being reasonable. Your Grace, Marcus said carefully, if you're planning mass interrogation of your own council, I'm planning to find whoever's still betraying me and demonstrate why restraint has limits, Kaedric interrupted. His hands were shaking now, not with fear, but with rage at himself for believing he could choose mercy without consequences. I tried evolution, Marcus. I offered exile instead of execution. I chose measured response over immediate violence. And the result is that my enemies recognized weakness and immediately exploited it. So now we do this the old way. He looked at Isla, seeing her expression shift through emotions too complex to name. Understanding, disappointment, resignation, and something that might have been approval of the worst kind. You were right, he said quietly. I'm not built for nobility. I'm built for violence. And anyone who misinterprets temporary restraint as permanent change is about to learn that lesson permanently. Before either Marcus or Isla could respond, the entire eastern wing exploded. The detonation shook Thornhaven's foundations, shattering windows and sending debris cascading across courtyards that had stood undamaged for 3 centuries. Emergency alarms screamed through corridors while Kaedric's security teams mobilized with practiced efficiency, responding to the kind of direct assault that hadn't occurred since his father's reign. Kaedric stood in the council chamber while his fortress burned, watching smoke pour from the guest wing where Isla had been sleeping 2 hours ago, and felt something inside him break completely. Not the clean fracture of something damaged beyond repair, but the catastrophic collapse of a structure that had been under pressure so long it had forgotten what stability felt like. Because this was the answer to his question about whether offering mercy was evolution or weakness. This was the world demonstrating that weakness invited destruction. This was confirmation that his father had been right about everything. That power required absolute commitment to eliminating threats permanently. That emotional attachment was just another form of tactical vulnerability, and that men who hesitated to take what was necessary ended up as footnotes in other men's victories. Kaedric turned to Marcus, his voice emerging completely empty of emotion. Find everyone involved in this. I don't care if it's council members, household staff, or distant relatives. Find them all, and then bring them to me alive, because I want them conscious for what comes next. Your Grace, Isla said quietly, her voice carrying warning he couldn't afford to acknowledge. If you do this, if you revert completely to what you were, you'll prove that everything we've been trying to build was impossible from the start. Then it was impossible, Kaedric responded. His voice sounded dead even to himself. I spent 43 years building an empire through fear and violence. I spent 6 hours trying to be different. And the result is that my fortress is burning, and you nearly died because I was stupid enough to believe mercy was anything other than weakness by another name. He looked at her directly, letting her see exactly what was happening behind his carefully maintained defenses. You told me I needed to learn the difference between protecting you and possessing you. But here's the truth. I should have admitted from the beginning, I don't know that difference. I only know how to eliminate threats with overwhelming force until there's nothing left capable of hurting what's mine. And if that makes me a tyrant or a monster or whatever else you want to call it, at least you'll be alive to call me those things. Isla stared at him with an expression that contained rage and heartbreak in equal measure. Then I guess we both just learned something, she said softly. You learned that you can't change your fundamental nature without the world punishing you for it. And I learned that I was wrong about you being capable of evolution. She turned toward the door, her movements controlled despite the visible tremor in her hands. I'll help you find whoever did this, not because I approve of what you're about to do, but because they tried to kill me and I'm not interested in dying to preserve your moral development. But after this is over, after you've done whatever horrific things you're planning, I'm leaving. Because I can't watch you systematically destroy the part of yourself I thought was worth saving. She left without waiting for response, and Kaedric stood alone in the council chamber while his empire burned and the last fragile connection to his humanity walked out the door. Marcus remained, his expression carefully neutral, waiting for orders that would define whether Thornhaven survived or collapsed under the weight of internal betrayal. Find them, Kaedric repeated. His voice carried absolute certainty despite the fact that everything inside him was screaming, all of them. And Marcus? Yes, Your Grace? When you bring them to me, make sure they understand that mercy isn't on the table anymore. I'm done pretending evolution is possible. I'm done believing restraint is anything other than invitation for exploitation. And I'm done caring whether that makes me the monster everyone's always believed I was. He walked toward the window, watching smoke pour from the guest wing where Isla had slept and feeling the last fragments of whatever optimism he'd allowed himself shatter completely. Because 6 hours ago, he'd promised to try being different, to find ways of resolving conflict without defaulting to violence, to prove he was capable of protecting someone without possessing them. And the world had immediately demonstrated why those promises were fantasy, why mercy was weakness, why emotional attachment was just another form of exploitable vulnerability, why his father had been right about everything. Outside, Thornhaven burned. Inside, whatever remained of Kaedric Ashford's capacity for hope turned to ash alongside it. And somewhere in the smoke and chaos, the man who'd briefly believed he could be better than his worst instincts made a choice that would define everything that came after. He was done trying to be noble. He was done believing change was possible. And he was done pretending the world rewarded anything other than absolute, merciless, systematic elimination of every threat before it could destroy what mattered. Even if that approach killed him. Even if it meant losing Isla permanently. Even if it proved he'd been exactly what everyone always said. A monster who temporarily convinced himself he was capable of being human. The hunt began at dawn, methodical and merciless. And by the time it ended, every person who'd betrayed Kaedric Ashford understood why mercy had never been part of his vocabulary in the first place. The interrogation room in Thornhaven's basement had been designed by Kaedric's father with a single purpose: breaking people who believed they were strong enough to withstand pressure, concrete walls thick enough to muffle screaming, drains positioned to handle whatever fluids accumulated during questioning, lighting harsh enough to prevent rest but dim enough to distort perception of time. 3 generations of Ashford men had used this space to extract truth from enemies who thought loyalty or courage would protect them from consequences. Kaedric stood outside the reinforced door at dawn, listening to Marcus conduct preliminary interrogation on the 4 council members his security team had detained. 4 men who'd sat at his table for years, offering counsel and collecting wealth, while secretly coordinating with forces that wanted him destroyed. The betrayal wasn't surprising. Betrayal was the default state of aristocratic politics, but the scale of it was. Because these weren't opportunistic vultures capitalizing on perceived weakness. These were ideological enemies who'd spent years embedded inside his inner circle, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And they'd chosen his attachment to Isla as that moment. The recognition that his vulnerability had been so obvious, so exploitable, so catastrophically predictable made something cold settle into his chest. He'd spent 43 years eliminating emotional attachment specifically to prevent this scenario. Had systematically removed every soft target from his operational profile. Had convinced himself that isolation was the price of invulnerability. Then Isla had walked into Thornhaven 6 months ago, and he'd dismantled every defense mechanism he'd spent decades constructing, because she'd looked at him like he was human instead of just a predator in expensive clothing. His father would have called that weakness, would have identified Isla as a tactical liability requiring immediate elimination, would have understood that men in their position couldn't afford attachments that gave enemies leverage, and his father would have been absolutely right. The door opened. Marcus emerged with blood on his knuckles and an expression suggesting the interrogation had been productive but unpleasant. He closed the door carefully before speaking, his voice carrying the flat professional tone he used when discussing matters that required emotional distance. Your Grace, we have names. The conspiracy goes deeper than Voss. At least 7 council members were involved, including 2 we haven't detained yet. They've been coordinating with Lord Garrett's family and 3 other rival houses. The goal wasn't just kidnapping Lady Thorne, it was destabilizing your entire power structure by proving you'd become compromised by emotional attachment. Kaedric absorbed the information mechanically, his mind processing tactical implications, while something deeper calculated the body count this would require. 7 council members, multiple aristocratic families, coordinated conspiracy spanning months or possibly years. The kind of threat that demanded systematic elimination of everyone involved before the infection spread. What about the assault team that bombed the guest wing? Mercenaries, hired through intermediaries, but 2 of them survived the security response. They're being very cooperative now that they understand their employers aren't coming to extract them. Kedrick looked at Marcus, seeing recognition in his old friend's expression. They'd been through situations like this before, betrayals that required harsh responses. Threats that demanded permanent solutions. This was familiar territory, the kind of problem Kaedric had been handling since he took control of Thornhaven at 28. But something was different this time, because previous betrayals had been abstract, challenges to his authority that he'd eliminated efficiently. This betrayal was personal. They'd targeted Isla, had tried to kill her specifically to prove he'd become weak, had correctly identified that his attachment to her was exploitable vulnerability. And they'd been right. Bring them up one at a time, Kaedric said quietly, starting with whoever coordinated the bombing. I want to understand exactly how many people need to die before this stops. Your Grace. Marcus hesitated, an unusual display of uncertainty from someone who'd executed Kaedric's orders without question for 12 years. Lady Thorne is waiting in your study. She says she needs to speak with you before you proceed. Kaedric felt something twist inside his chest. Because Isla had made herself clear after the explosion, she'd help him find who was responsible, then leave because she couldn't watch him destroy whatever remained of his humanity in pursuit of revenge. She'd already decided he was beyond salvation, was probably upstairs right now preparing to deliver some final judgment about his character before disappearing from his life permanently. Part of him wanted to avoid that conversation entirely. To proceed with the systematic elimination of everyone who'd betrayed him, then deal with Isla's departure after the immediate threat was neutralized. It was the tactically sound approach. Prioritize operational security over relationship maintenance. But another part of him, the part that had pressed a loaded pistol against his temple 48 hours ago, wondering what the point was of surviving alone, recognized that avoiding Isla now meant, confirming every fear she'd articulated about him, being incapable of prioritizing human connection over tactical advantage. Tell her I'll be up in 10 minutes. Kaedric said finally. And Marcus, make sure the prisoners understand that their survival depends entirely on providing information that prevents me from killing their families alongside them. Marcus nodded and returned to the interrogation room, leaving Kaedric alone in the corridor with his thoughts and the particular kind of exhaustion that came from recognizing you were about to make decisions that would either save your empire or destroy whatever remained of your soul. The problem with being good at violence was that it became your default solution to every problem. Betrayal? Kill the betrayers. Threat? Eliminate the threat. Vulnerability? Remove the vulnerability through overwhelming force. It was efficient, it was effective, and it had worked perfectly for 43 years. Until it left him alone in a fortress full of corpses, wondering why survival felt like slow death. Kaedric climbed the stairs toward his study, each step feeling like walking toward execution. His own or someone else's, he wasn't entirely sure which. The damage from the explosion was visible throughout the eastern wing, shattered windows, scorched walls, the particular smell of burnt wood and destroyed lives that came from violence deployed inside spaces designed for safety. His household staff moved through corridors with practiced efficiency, cleaning debris and restoring order with the kind of calm competence that came from serving a duke, who generated this level of chaos regularly. They didn't look at him directly, didn't acknowledge his presence beyond minimal required deference. They understood their survival depended on being invisible background machinery that kept Thornhaven functioning regardless of how many people their employer murdered. It was exactly the kind of terror-based loyalty his father had cultivated, the kind that ensured obedience but eliminated any possibility of genuine human connection, the kind that left you dying inside long before your body stopped functioning. Isla was standing at his study window when he entered, her silhouette backlit by morning sun that made her look simultaneously solid and ethereal. She didn't turn when he closed the door, her attention fixed on something outside that he couldn't see from his position. Her posture carried exhaustion and tension in equal measure, shoulders tight with the particular stress that came from spending hours deciding whether to stay or leave someone who'd proven they were exactly as damaged as advertised. "You're planning to kill them all," she said without preamble, her voice flat and emotionless. Not a question. A statement of fact based on knowing him well enough to predict his tactical responses. Kedrick moved to his desk, pouring whiskey with hands that were steadier than they should have been given the circumstances. "I'm planning to eliminate threats before they compound. 7 council members conspired to destabilize my authority by using you as leverage. Multiple aristocratic families coordinated the attack. If I don't respond decisively, every other enemy will recognize weakness and move against me simultaneously." It was sound tactical logic, the kind of reasoning that had built his empire and maintained his position for 15 years. The approach that had never failed him. The approach that had also left him alone in this study with a loaded pistol pressed against his temple 48 hours ago. Isla turned from the window, her dark eyes fixing on him with that unnerving intensity that suggested she could see straight through his tactical justifications to the terrified mess underneath. "So your solution is to prove them right. They said you'd become compromised by attachment to me, that your judgment was impaired, that emotional connection made you exploitable, and your response is to murder everyone involved, which definitively proves that caring about me turned you into exactly the kind of unstable tyrant they accused you of being." Kedrick drank the whiskey in one swallow, welcoming the burn. "They tried to kill you. They coordinated an assault on my fortress. They embedded themselves inside my inner circle for years, specifically to exploit the one vulnerability I'd allowed myself. What response would you suggest that doesn't involve eliminating threats permanently?" "I'd suggest you consider that maybe the vulnerability isn't loving me," Isla said quietly, moving away from the window until she was standing across his desk. "Maybe the vulnerability is being so terrified of emotional attachment that the moment someone threatens it, you immediately revert to maximum violence because that's the only response you trust." She placed her hands flat on the scarred oak surface between them, leaning forward with the particular intensity of someone delivering an ultimatum. "You have 7 traitors in your basement right now. 7 men who betrayed you, endangered me, and tried to destroy everything you've built. And you're absolutely correct that letting them live sends a message that betrayal is survivable. But here's what you're not considering. Killing them sends an equally clear message. It tells every other potential enemy that Duke Kedrick Ashford can be manipulated into catastrophic overreaction by threatening the people he cares about." Kedrick stared at her, his mind racing through tactical implications he'd been too focused on immediate threat response to consider. Because she was right. Every enemy watching this situation would be taking notes, would be learning that his attachment to Isla was a confirmed vulnerability that generated predictable responses, would be calculating whether they could leverage similar tactics in future conflicts, which meant that killing everyone involved didn't eliminate his weakness, it advertised it. The realization hit harder than it should have, because it meant there was no tactically perfect solution, no strategic approach that simultaneously eliminated the immediate threat and prevented future exploitation. He was trapped between responses that were all suboptimal, all dangerous, all guaranteed to create new problems while solving old ones. "What do you want me to do, Isla?" He heard the exhaustion in his own voice. "Let them live? Release them with stern warnings? Hope that mercy is interpreted as strength instead of weakness? I tried that approach with Voss 8 hours ago, and the immediate result was my fortress getting bombed." "I'm not telling you to show mercy," Isla said, her voice carrying steel beneath the exhaustion. "I'm telling you to be strategic instead of reactive. You have 7 traitors who've exposed a conspiracy involving multiple aristocratic families. That's not a problem you solve through execution. It's an opportunity you exploit through information extraction and political maneuvering." She straightened, moving around the desk until she was standing close enough to touch but maintaining careful distance. "You want to eliminate threats?" Fine, but do it intelligently. Force them to provide evidence against their co-conspirators. Use that evidence to dismantle the entire network instead of just killing the foot soldiers while the leadership remains intact. And demonstrate to everyone watching that Duke Cadric Ashford doesn't need maximum violence to maintain control. He just needs to be smarter and more ruthless than everyone trying to take him down. Cadric looked at her, seeing the strategic mind that had drawn him to her 6 months ago. The recognition that she understood power and violence as thoroughly as he did, but approached them from directions he'd never considered. She wasn't advocating mercy or restraint. She was advocating for weaponized intelligence instead of blunt force. And you think that approach won't be interpreted as weakness? I think that approach might be interpreted as evolution, Isla responded, which is infinitely more terrifying to your enemies than predictable violence. A duke who kills everyone who crosses him is dangerous. A duke who turns betrayal into strategic advantage while maintaining perfect control? That duke is unstoppable. It was seductive logic, the kind of reasoning that appealed to the part of him that still believed he could be more than just a predator in expensive clothing. But it was also terrifying, because it required trusting that strategic patience would work better than immediate elimination. And trusting anything beyond overwhelming force was how you ended up with a loaded pistol pressed against your temple, wondering why survival felt like dying slowly. Before Cadric could respond, Marcus entered without knocking. A breach of protocol that meant something had changed dramatically in the 10 minutes since they'd last spoken. His expression carried the particular urgency that came from veteran soldiers recognizing when situations were about to spiral beyond control. Your Grace, we have a developing situation. Lord Garrett's family just mobilized their private military forces. They're moving toward Thornhaven with enough personnel to constitute an actual army. Estimated arrival is 3 hours, and they're not coming to negotiate. The room went absolutely silent, because what Marcus had just described wasn't assassination attempt or political maneuvering. It was open warfare. A direct military assault on Thornhaven by an aristocratic family that had decided the potential rewards of destroying Cadric outweighed the risks of failure. How many? 200 armed personnel, 12 armored vehicles, artillery support. They're not trying to be subtle. They're staging an invasion. Cadric felt something cold settle into his chest. The recognition that this was no longer about interrogating traitors or dismantling conspiracies. This was existential threat requiring immediate military response. The kind of situation where strategic patience was just another word for suicide. He looked at Isla, seeing recognition in her expression. She understood what this meant, understood that her suggestion of weaponized intelligence and strategic maneuvering had just become irrelevant because Garrett's family had forced the confrontation into territory where the only available responses were fight or surrender. And Cadric Ashford didn't surrender. Mobilize all security personnel, he said quietly, his voice returning to the flat, emotionless tone that preceded systematic violence. Establish defensive perimeter at maximum effective range. Activate all fortifications and weapons systems. And Marcus? Yes, Your Grace? If Garrett's forces breach Thornhaven's walls, I want every member of their family tree eliminated. Not just the soldiers coming here, everyone. Their children, their elderly relatives, their distant cousins. I want their entire bloodline erased so thoroughly that historians won't be able to confirm they ever existed. The silence that followed felt like the room holding its breath, because what Cadric had just ordered wasn't military defense. It was genocidal retaliation. The kind of response that would either cement his reputation as too dangerous to challenge or mark him as a tyrant, who'd finally lost whatever restraint had prevented him from becoming his father's worst impulses made flesh. Marcus nodded once and left to execute his orders, understanding that moral objections were irrelevant when your employer was about to fight a war for his survival. Isla remained, her expression carrying something between horror and resignation. So much for strategic intelligence and political maneuvering, she said quietly. Cadric met her eyes, letting her see exactly what was happening behind his carefully maintained defenses. You were right about everything. About me being terrified of vulnerability. About my attachment to you being exploitable weakness. About violence being my substitute for emotional intimacy. But you were wrong about one thing. What was I wrong about? You thought I was capable of evolution. Thought I could learn to respond to threats without defaulting to maximum violence. Thought there was something inside me worth salvaging. Cadric moved to the weapons rack, beginning the methodical process of arming himself for combat. But the truth is that I'm exactly what my father built me to be, a predator who maintains control through overwhelming force. And the moment I tried to be anything else, the world immediately punished me for it. He checked ammunition and 2 pistols, his movements mechanical and practiced. So I'm done trying to evolve. Done believing restraint is anything other than invitation for destruction. And I'm done pretending that caring about you doesn't make me catastrophically dangerous to everyone who threatens your existence. Isla watched him arm himself with an expression that contained exhaustion, rage, and something that might have been grief. Then what was the point of any of this? What was the point of me trying to teach you the difference between protection and possession if you're just going to revert to genocide the moment someone challenges you? The point was proving I was right all along, Kedrick responded. His voice sounded dead even to himself. Emotional attachment is weakness. Caring about people makes you exploitable. And the only way to survive in a world built on power is to eliminate anything that gives your enemies leverage. He strapped on body armor, each buckle clicking into place with finality. So thank you for the 6 months of attempting to salvage my humanity. It was a noble effort. But we both just learned something important. I don't have humanity left to salvage. I have survival instinct and tactical capacity and willingness to burn everything threatening what's mine. And if that makes me a monster, at least I'm a monster who keeps you alive. Isla stared at him for a long moment, tears tracking down her face despite her expression remaining perfectly controlled. Then I guess this is where I tell you that I can't watch you do this. That I'm leaving because staying means becoming complicit in exactly the kind of systematic violence I've spent my life trying to escape. Then leave, Kedrick said flatly. His hands were steady as he loaded the final weapon. Get out before Garrett's forces arrive. Marcus will provide escort to ensure you reach safety. And maybe in whatever life you build after this, you can pretend you didn't spend 6 months trying to fix someone who is broken beyond repair. Isla crossed the distance between them in 3 strides. Her movement so sudden he barely registered it before she grabbed his face with both hands, forcing him to look at her directly instead of through the tactical lens he'd retreated behind. Listen to me very carefully, Kedrick Ashford. I am not leaving. I am not running. And I am not abandoning you to fight this alone because some aristocratic vultures decided today was the day they'd try to take you down. You think you're a monster? Fine. You think you're broken beyond repair? Maybe. But you're my monster, and I'll be damned if I let you face an army without someone watching your back. She kissed him then, not gently, not romantically, but with the particular violence of someone who'd decided to stay, despite every rational instinct screaming that survival meant distance. When she pulled back, her eyes were fierce despite the tears. So here's what's going to happen. We're going to defend this fortress. We're going to destroy everyone who thought your attachment to me made you weak. And then, after the smoke clears and the bodies are counted, you and I are going to have a very long conversation about whether love is supposed to feel like mutually assured destruction. Kedrick stared at her, something cracking inside the carefully maintained armor he'd spent 43 years constructing. Because he'd expected her to leave, had given her permission to escape, had practically ordered her to save herself while he reverted to being the monster everyone believed he was. Instead, she'd stayed, had chosen to remain beside him despite knowing exactly what he was about to do and exactly how catastrophic the consequences would be, had decided that whatever damaged connection existed between them was worth fighting for, even if fighting meant becoming complicit in exactly the kind of violence she'd spent 6 months trying to. Help him move beyond. You're insane, he said quietly, his voice rough with emotions he couldn't name. Probably, Isla agreed. But so are you, and at least we're insane together. She moved to the weapons rack, selecting firearms with the practiced efficiency of someone who understood violence, even if she didn't default to it. You have body armor that fits someone my size? Marcus keeps emergency gear for all household personnel, Kedrick responded, his mind still processing the fact that she hadn't left. Second cabinet, left side. They armed themselves in silence, the particular quiet that came from 2 people who'd chosen to stand together against overwhelming odds, despite having no guarantee they'd survive the next 3 hours. Outside, Marcus was coordinating defensive preparations, establishing firing positions, activating automated weapon systems, positioning personnel for maximum tactical advantage. Inside, Kedrick felt something fundamental shift, because for 43 years he'd faced threats alone, had built an empire on the assumption that isolation was necessary for survival, had convinced himself that anyone standing beside him in combat was just another tactical asset requiring protection. But Isla wasn't standing beside him as an asset requiring protection. She was standing beside him as an equal choosing to fight because she'd decided he was worth the catastrophic risk of staying. The distinction mattered in ways he couldn't fully articulate. Your Grace, Marcus returned with tactical displays showing Garrett's approach vectors. An estimated time to contact. Defensive perimeter is established. All personnel are armed and positioned. Automated systems are online. We have approximately 2 hours before engagement range. He glanced at Isla in full combat gear, recognition flashing across his weathered features. Lady Thorne will be fighting alongside us? Lady Thorne will be defending her home, Isla corrected, her voice carrying steel. Anyone who has a problem with that can discuss it after we've killed everyone trying to breach these walls. Marcus nodded once, accepting her presence without argument. Then we're as ready as we're going to be. The question is whether Your Grace wants to attempt negotiation or proceed directly to combat. Cedric looked at his oldest friend, seeing the tactical calculation in his expression. Marcus understood that negotiation was possible, could probably extract concessions from Garrett's family that would prevent immediate bloodshed. But he also understood that negotiating from a defensive position would be interpreted as weakness, and weakness invited exploitation. No negotiation, Cedric said flatly. They mobilized an army against Thornhaven. They coordinated betrayal from inside my inner circle. They tried to kill Isla. The time for negotiation ended when they decided military invasion was their opening strategy. He moved to the tactical displays, studying approach vectors and defensive positioning with the focused intensity of someone who'd been preparing for exactly this scenario his entire life. We fight. We win. And then we make sure every other aristocratic family watching this understands that threatening Thornhaven isn't a calculated risk. It's suicide with extra steps. Marcus nodded, unsurprised by the decision. Rules of engagement? Cedric looked at Isla, seeing her expression shift through emotions too complex to name. She understood what he was asking. Understood that rules of engagement determined whether this became surgical military defense or the kind of massacre that defined his father's reign. She could stop him, could insist on restraint and measured response, could demand that he prove evolution was possible even in the middle of existential combat. Instead, she met his eyes and spoke with absolute clarity. No survivors, no mercy, no restraint. They came here to destroy us. We show them why that was the last mistake they'll ever make. It was permission, validation, confirmation that she understood exactly who he was and what he was capable of, and had chosen to stand beside him anyway. Cedric felt something break inside him. Not the collapse of something damaged, but the shattering of the last fragile barrier between the man he'd tried to be and the monster he'd always been. You heard her, he said to Marcus. No survivors. The 2 hours before combat felt like dying slowly. Cedric moved through Thornhaven's fortifications with Isla at his side, checking defensive positions and ensuring every element of their response was optimized for maximum lethality. His security personnel watched them with expressions ranging from professional focus to barely concealed terror, understanding that their Duke was about to deploy violence on a scale that would either secure Thornhaven's position permanently or mark them all as war criminals. The western battlements offered the clearest view of Garrett's approaching forces. Cedric stood beside Isla, watching dust clouds mark their advance, armored vehicles moving in coordinated formation with the particular precision that came from professional military planning. 200 personnel, 12 vehicles. Artillery support capable of breaching Thornhaven's walls if positioned correctly. It should have been overwhelming. Should have forced negotiation or strategic retreat. Should have demonstrated that Cedric's position was untenable and survival required compromise. Instead, it just made him angry, because these vultures had looked at his carefully maintained empire and decided today was the day they'd tear it down. Had coordinated betrayal, orchestrated kidnapping, bombed his home, and mobilized an army. All because they'd correctly identified that his attachment to Isla was exploitable weakness. They'd been right about the weakness. They'd been catastrophically wrong about what happened when you exploited it. You're smiling, Isla observed quietly, her voice carrying something between concern and fascination. Why are you smiling? Because they think they're hunting me, Cedric responded. His voice sounded distant, even to himself. They think overwhelming force and coordinated strategy gives them advantage. They think I'm compromised by emotional attachment and incapable of effective response. He looked at her directly, letting her see exactly what was happening behind his carefully controlled expression. They have no idea that the only thing more dangerous than Duke Cadric Ashford maintaining perfect tactical control is Duke Cadric Ashford, who stopped caring whether he survives as long as his enemies don't. Isla stared at him with an expression that contained understanding and horror in equal measure. That's not tactics, Cadric. That's suicide with extra steps. Maybe, he acknowledged, but at least I'll die proving that threatening what's mine was the last mistake they'll ever make. Garrett's forces reached effective engagement range 90 minutes later, their artillery positioning for bombardment while infantry established assault formations. Professional, coordinated, executed with the kind of precision that came from experienced military commanders who understood siege warfare. Cadric watched them deploy from Thornhaven's command center, surrounded by tactical displays and communication arrays that connected him to every defensive position. Marcus coordinated responses with veteran efficiency, while Isla stood beside Cadric like a silent judge witnessing his descent into the violence he'd spent 6 months trying to move beyond. "They're in position," Marcus reported, waiting for final authorization to commence assault. "If you want to offer terms—" "No terms," Cadric interrupted. "Fire everything." Thornhaven's fortifications erupted simultaneously, automated weapon systems and positioned artillery, unleashing coordinated devastation that turned Garrett's careful formations into chaos within seconds. The sound was deafening. Explosions, gunfire, screaming metal and screaming men blending into cacophony that drowned out everything except the immediate tactical necessity of destroying threats before they could adapt. Cadric watched the carnage unfold through tactical displays, his expression empty of emotion despite the fact that he was ordering systematic slaughter of 200 people. Some were professional soldiers. Some were probably conscripts forced into service by aristocratic obligation. All of them were dying because they'd chosen to stand between him and the preservation of what mattered. The assault lasted 40 minutes before Garrett's forces recognized they'd catastrophically miscalculated. Whatever intelligence they'd received about Thornhaven's defensive capabilities had been incomplete or outdated. They'd expected fortified estate defended by private security. They'd encountered military installation designed to withstand siege warfare and commanded by someone who'd stopped caring about proportional response. The survivors retreated in disorder, leaving behind burning vehicles and approximately 70 casualties. Cadric ordered pursuit, his security forces following Garrett's remnants with instructions that had been clear from the beginning. No survivors. Isla watched the tactical displays in silence, her expression unreadable. When the last enemy combatant had been eliminated and Thornhaven's forces returned to defensive positions, she finally spoke. 70 dead. Another 130 executed during pursuit. An entire aristocratic family's military force erased in under an hour. That's not defense, Cadric. That's extermination. That's survival, Cadric corrected. His voice sounded hollow even to himself. They came here to destroy me. I demonstrated why that was impossible, and now every other family watching will understand that threatening Thornhaven isn't a calculated risk. It's guaranteed destruction. And you think that makes you stronger? Isla's voice carried exhaustion instead of accusation. You think proving you're willing to commit massacre makes you invulnerable? Cadric turned to face her, seeing judgment in her eyes despite her having given permission for exactly this outcome 2 hours ago. I think it makes me alive, he said quietly. I think it proves I'm capable of protecting what matters, even if the cost is becoming the monster everyone always believed I was. And I think it demonstrates that you were wrong about one fundamental thing. What was I wrong about? You thought evolution was possible. Thought I could learn to respond to threats without defaulting to maximum violence. But the truth is that some people are just built for violence, Isla. And no amount of love or connection or attempted redemption changes that basic architecture. He gestured toward the tactical displays showing the aftermath of combat, burning vehicles, scattered corpses, the particular devastation that came from overwhelming force deployed without restraint. This is who I am. This is what I'm capable of. And if you're finally ready to admit that staying beside me means becoming complicit in exactly this kind of systematic brutality, then now would be the time to leave. Isla looked at him for a long moment, her expression cycling through emotions too complex to name. Then she did something that surprised him completely. She laughed. Not hysteria, not breakdown, just exhausted, slightly unhinged recognition of absurdity. "You're an idiot," she said, moving toward him until they were close enough to touch. "You think I didn't know exactly who you were 6 months ago? You think I somehow missed the fact that Duke Cadric Ashford built an empire through systematic violence and ruthless elimination of threats? I knew, Cadric. I've always known. The question was never whether you were capable of this." She gestured toward the tactical displays. "The question was whether you were capable of being more than just this. And you still haven't answered it." Before Cadric could respond, alarms screamed through the command center. Marcus spun toward communication arrays, his expression shifting from professional calm to genuine alarm faster than Cadric had seen in 12 years. "Your Grace, we have incoming. Fast-moving aircraft. Military grade. Origin unidentified. ETA 90 seconds. The room went absolutely silent. Because what Marcus had just described wasn't aristocratic families deploying private security. This was actual military intervention. Crown forces or foreign power or someone with resources that dwarfed anything Garrett's family could have mobilized. Identification? Working on it. They're broadcasting Crown authorization codes. But Marcus stopped, his expression going pale. "But what?" Cadric demanded. "But the codes are from the King's personal security detail. Your Grace, I think the Crown just decided your activities have become threatening enough to warrant direct intervention." Isla's hand found Cadric's, her grip tight enough to hurt. "That's impossible. The Crown doesn't deploy military forces against aristocratic families without formal charges, and the Crown does whatever it wants," Cadric interrupted quietly, his mind already processing implications that meant everything he'd just fought for was about to become irrelevant. "And if they've decided I've become too dangerous to tolerate, then the last hour of violence just gave them perfect justification for elimination." He looked at Marcus, seeing recognition in his old friend's expression. They both understood what this meant. Crown intervention wasn't arrest or investigation. It was sanction. Permission for forces representing the monarchy to eliminate a problem that had grown beyond acceptable parameters. Duke Cadric Ashford had spent 43 years building an empire through violence. And now that violence had finally attracted attention from powers he couldn't intimidate or eliminate, outside aircraft approached carrying forces that would either arrest him, execute him, or do something far worse. Inside, Cadric stood beside Isla in a fortress built from brutality and maintained through fear, finally understanding that some threats couldn't be eliminated through overwhelming force. Some threats were just consequence for becoming exactly what the world had always warned him against. And now those consequences were 90 seconds away from making his survival irrelevant, regardless of how many people he was willing to kill. The aircraft descended toward Thornhaven like judgment made physical, and Cadric Ashford realized with perfect clarity that he'd finally run out of enemies he could murder his way past. The aircraft touched down on Thornhaven's western courtyard with mechanical precision, their rotors cutting through smoke that still hung in the air from the massacre Cadric had orchestrated 90 minutes earlier. 3 military helicopters bearing royal insignia, each disgorging armed personnel who moved with the particular efficiency of Crown forces, authorized to use lethal force without political consequence. 40 soldiers in total, surrounding the command center where Cadric stood beside Isla, watching his empire collapse in real time. Marcus was coordinating with his security teams through encrypted channels, his voice carrying the flat professional tone that came from calculating odds that weren't favorable. "Your Grace, we can establish defensive positions, but Crown forces are authorized to deploy heavy weapons if we resist. This isn't like Garrett's assault. These people have legal mandate and unlimited resources." Cadric watched the tactical displays showing Crown forces establishing perimeter around Thornhaven's central structures, their movements suggesting they'd studied his fortress extensively and knew exactly how to neutralize his advantages. Professional, methodical, executed with the kind of calm certainty that came from people who understood they represented power beyond anything a single duke could challenge. For 43 years, he'd built his position through violence and intimidation, had convinced himself that being the most dangerous predator in the territory meant he was untouchable, had systematically eliminated every threat until people believed Duke Cadric Ashford was invulnerable. Now, forces representing actual invulnerability had arrived to demonstrate the difference between being feared and being powerful. "Stand down," Cadric said quietly. His voice carried exhaustion instead of tactical certainty. "Tell all security personnel to disarm and comply with Crown directives. No resistance. No heroic last stands. Marcus stared at him with an expression that mixed shock and something that might have been relief. Your Grace, if we surrender, if we resist, everyone in Thornhaven dies, Cadric interrupted. The Crown isn't here to negotiate. They're here to eliminate a problem that's grown beyond acceptable parameters. And I'm not sacrificing my people to delay the inevitable. He looked at Isla, seeing recognition in her dark eyes. She understood what this meant, understood that his decision to stand down wasn't tactical calculation, but acceptance that some consequences couldn't be eliminated through overwhelming force. Marcus issued stand-down orders through command channels, his voice steady despite visible tension in his shoulders. Within 3 minutes, Thornhaven's security forces had disarmed and withdrawn to designated areas, while Crown forces consolidated their control. Professional, efficient. The kind of operation that came from people who'd executed similar sanctions countless times. A knock at the command center door. Formal, almost polite. The particular courtesy that preceded violence done in the name of legitimate authority. Cadric moved to open it himself, finding a woman in her 50s wearing military dress uniform with enough insignia to suggest she commanded significant resources. Her expression carried professional neutrality. Not hostile, not sympathetic, just focused on executing her mandate efficiently. Duke Ashford. I'm Commander Elise Martin, representing His Majesty's interests in the Northern Territories. I've been authorized to discuss the circumstances that brought Crown forces to your estate. Discuss is an interesting word choice, Cadric observed. His voice carried no emotion despite the fact that his empire was collapsing around him. Usually, Crown forces arrive to arrest or eliminate, not discuss. Commander Martin stepped inside, her movements controlled and deliberate. 2 armed personnel flanked her but remained near the door, suggesting this was formal engagement rather than immediate arrest. She glanced at Isla with professional assessment before returning attention to Cadric. The Crown is aware of recent events. The assault you conducted on the Westgate Syndicate, the massacre of Lord Garrett's military forces, the systematic elimination of multiple aristocratic families over a 48-hour period. Under normal circumstances, such actions would constitute grounds for immediate sanction. Under normal circumstances, Cadric repeated, implying these aren't normal circumstances? Commander Martin moved to the tactical displays, studying the aftermath of combat with the veteran eyes that had seen worse and would see worse again. The Crown has been monitoring your activities for years, Duke Ashford. Your methods are brutal, but they're effective. You've maintained stability in territories that were collapsing under corruption and incompetence when you took control 15 years ago. The northern provinces generate significant revenue and maintain strategic importance specifically because you rule them with absolute discipline. She turned to face him directly, her expression shifting to something harder. But recent events suggest your judgment has become compromised. You've deployed violence on a scale that threatens regional stability. You've eliminated multiple aristocratic families without formal charges or crown authorization. And you've demonstrated that personal attachment makes you capable of catastrophic overreaction. The assessment was accurate enough that Cadric couldn't dispute it. He'd spent 48 hours proving that his attachment to Isla was exploitable weakness that generated exactly the kind of destabilizing violence his enemies had predicted. So, you're here to eliminate that problem, he said flatly. Execute me for exceeding acceptable parameters of brutality and install someone more controllable. Efficient, probably already planned. Commander Martin studied him with an expression that suggested she was evaluating something beyond standard threat assessment. Actually, I'm here to offer you a choice, which is more than most people in your position receive. Cadric felt Isla's hand find his, her grip tight with tension. What kind of choice? The kind that determines whether you die today or live long enough to become something other than the monster you've convinced yourself you have to be. Commander Martin gestured toward chairs positioned around the command table. Sit, both of you. This conversation requires context. They sat, Cadric maintaining tactical awareness despite recognizing that resistance was futile. Crown forces surrounded Thornhaven. His security teams were disarmed, and Commander Martin represented power he couldn't intimidate or eliminate. For the first time in 43 years, he was completely without leverage. The feeling was terrifying and oddly liberating simultaneously. Commander Martin remained standing, her posture suggesting this was formal briefing rather than casual conversation. The Crown has been aware of Lady Isla Thorne's presence in Thornhaven for 6 months. We've monitored your relationship through various intelligence channels. And we've watched with considerable interest as Duke Cadric Ashford, most feared man in the Northern Territories, demonstrated unprecedented behavioral changes. She pulled up files on the tactical display, showing intelligence reports that tracked his activities with disturbing thoroughness. You reduced executions by 30% over 4 months. You offered exile to Lord Voss instead of immediate elimination despite clear betrayal. You attempted negotiation with merchant guilds that previously you would have destroyed for questioning your authority. These changes weren't dramatic, but they were noticeable to people monitoring your patterns. Kedrick stared at the intelligence reports, seeing his own evolution documented with clinical precision. Changes he'd barely acknowledged to himself, displayed as data suggesting that Isla's presence had fundamentally altered his operational approach. Then Garrett's family forced confrontation, Commander Martin continued, and you reverted to maximum violence, murdered 200 people in under 2 hours, demonstrated exactly the kind of destabilizing brutality that makes the Crown nervous about allowing powerful men to maintain independent authority. She paused, letting that assessment settle. So here's your choice, Duke Ashford. You can accept Crown supervision going forward, regular oversight, mandatory reporting of any enforcement actions, and restrictions on independent military operations. You maintain your position and your territories, but you surrender the absolute authority that's defined your rule for 15 years. And if I refuse, then you're executed within the hour for crimes against Crown stability, and someone else inherits Thornhaven. Probably someone with less tactical brilliance and more interest in keeping the Crown happy. Your choice. Isla's grip on his hand tightened to painful pressure. This is your idea of mercy? Forcing him to choose between surrender and death? Commander Martin looked at her with an expression that carried unexpected sympathy. This is the Crown acknowledging that Duke Ashford has value beyond his capacity for violence. Most people who deploy the level of brutality he's demonstrated over the last 48 hours would already be dead. The fact that he's being offered any choice at all suggests someone believes he's capable of evolution. She returned attention to Kaedric, her voice softening slightly. The question is whether you believe it, whether you think there's something inside you worth preserving beyond the monster your father built. Because if all you are is tactical violence and systematic intimidation, then Crown supervision won't change anything. It'll just delay your inevitable elimination. Kaedric sat in silence, processing implications that felt like dying slowly. Because what Commander Martin was offering wasn't mercy. It was test. A final evaluation of whether Duke Kaedric Ashford was capable of being more than just predator in expensive clothing. Accept supervision, and he'd spend the rest of his life proving he could maintain control without defaulting to maximum violence. Refuse, and he'd die confirming every fear about men like him being too dangerous to tolerate. Both options felt like losing, but one option let him keep breathing. And more importantly, one option meant Isla didn't have to watch him die for being exactly what the world had built him to be. How long do I have to decide? His voice sounded distant even to himself. You have until I finish this conversation, Commander Martin responded, which gives you approximately 3 minutes to determine whether survival matters more than absolute authority. She moved toward the window, her posture suggesting this was deliberate, giving him space to discuss with Isla without obvious surveillance. Kedrick turned to face the woman who'd spent 6 months trying to salvage something human from the hollow architecture of his personality. Her expression carried exhaustion, fear, and desperate hope in equal measure. Tell me what to do, he said quietly, because I genuinely don't know if accepting supervision is evolution or just slower suicide. Isla looked at him with eyes that had witnessed every version of him over 6 months. The tactical predator, the damaged man, the monster who'd murdered 200 people, the person who'd tried choosing restraint before the world punished him for weakness. I can't tell you what to do, Kaedric. This has to be your choice. That's not helpful. I know. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to barely audible. But I can tell you what I think. I think you've spent 43 years believing that absolute control was the only thing keeping you alive. And I think the last 48 hours proved that absolute control is exactly what's killing you. Her hand moved to his face, forcing him to meet her eyes directly. You want to know if accepting supervision is evolution? I don't know. Maybe it is. Maybe it's just another form of cage. But I do know that dying here today means everyone who said you were incapable of change was right. And I'm not ready to admit that yet. Are you asking me to surrender? I'm asking you to survive. However that looks, whatever it costs. Because I didn't stay beside you through massacre and crown intervention just to watch you choose death over admitting you need help. Kadric stared at her, feeling something fundamental shift inside the carefully maintained armor he'd constructed. Because she was right about everything. About him being terrified of vulnerability. About violence being his substitute for emotional intimacy. About his entire operational model being built on the assumption that caring about people made you exploitable. But she was also wrong about one critical thing. He wasn't afraid of needing help. He was afraid of discovering there was nothing left worth helping. Commander Martin turned from the window, her expression professionally neutral. Time's up, Duke Ashford. What's your decision? Kadric stood slowly, his movements deliberate despite the exhaustion pulling at every muscle. He looked at the tactical displays showing Thornhaven under Crown occupation, his fortress reduced to supervised territory in under 3 hours. Everything he'd built through violence and intimidation, now maintained only through permission from powers he couldn't challenge. His father would have called this betrayal of everything the Ashford name represented, would have chosen death over submitting to external authority, would have understood that men in their position either ruled absolutely or died trying. And his father had died alone in this fortress, with stroke-induced paralysis, while everyone who'd feared him celebrated his suffering. I accept supervision, Kadric said quietly. His voice carried no emotion despite the fact that he was surrendering the absolute authority that had defined his existence for 15 years. Whatever conditions the Crown requires, whatever restrictions are necessary, I accept. The room went absolutely silent, because everyone present understood they'd just witnessed something unprecedented. Duke Kadric Ashford choosing survival over sovereignty, admitting that maintaining his position mattered less than remaining alive. It should have felt like defeat. Instead, it felt like the first honest decision he'd made in 43 years. Commander Martin nodded once, professional satisfaction evident in her expression. Wise choice, Duke Ashford. Crown supervision begins immediately. You'll receive formal documentation outlining restrictions and reporting requirements. Any violation results in immediate sanction without appeal. Understood? Understood. She moved toward the door, her armed escort falling into formation. One more thing, Duke Ashford. The Crown is aware that Lady Thorne's presence contributed to behavioral changes we found. Promising. She'll be permitted to remain in Thornhaven under the same supervision requirements. Any objection? Kadric looked at Isla, seeing relief and exhaustion in equal measure. No objection. Commander Martin left with her escort, Crown forces withdrawing to establish perimeter monitoring while leaving Thornhaven's internal operations largely intact. Professional, efficient. The kind of operation that demonstrated they'd done this before and would do it again. Within 30 minutes, the fortress had returned to uneasy quiet. Crown forces maintained external surveillance, while Kadric's household staff began cleaning debris from combat operations that felt like they'd occurred in another lifetime. Marcus approached cautiously, his expression suggesting he wasn't sure whether to offer congratulations or condolences. Your Grace, security teams are requesting guidance on operational protocols under Crown supervision. Maintain standard defensive posture, Kadric responded. His voice sounded hollow. No independent operations without Crown authorization. Full transparency on all enforcement actions. And Marcus? Yes, Your Grace. Thank you for 12 years of following orders that ranged from necessary to catastrophic. I know this isn't what you signed up for. Marcus allowed himself a slight smile, the first genuine expression Kadric had seen from him in 48 hours. Your Grace, I signed up to serve Duke Kadric Ashford. Whether he's operating with absolute authority or Crown supervision doesn't change that fundamental commitment. He left to coordinate with security teams, and Kadric stood alone with Isla in the command center where he'd ordered systematic violence less than 3 hours earlier. The silence between them felt weighted with implications neither could fully articulate. Finally, Isla spoke, her voice carrying exhaustion that came from 6 months of trying to salvage someone who'd spent 43 years convinced he was beyond salvation. So that's it? You accept supervision, surrender absolute authority, and now we just continue? Like nothing happened? Kadric moved to the window, watching Crown forces establish permanent monitoring positions around his fortress. Like everything happened. Like I spent 48 hours proving every fear you ever had about me being incapable of choosing restraint over violence. Like I murdered 200 people because they threatened what I'd claimed as mine. He turned to face her, letting her see the exhaustion and self-awareness that 43 years of carefully maintained defenses had prevented. You were right about everything, Isla. about me being terrified of vulnerability, about violence being my substitute for actual human connection, about my entire operational model being built on eliminating anything that gave enemies leverage. And you were right about the most important thing. I was dying inside long before my body would stop functioning. So what happens now? Kedrick considered the question with the same brutal honesty he'd spent his life avoiding. Now I spend however long I have left learning to be something other than the monster my father built. Learning the difference between protecting people and possessing them. Learning that survival without anything worth protecting is just dying slowly with extra steps. He moved closer, close enough to touch, but maintaining careful distance. And I do all of that while accepting that I might fail. That 43 years of systematic brutality might have damaged something fundamental beyond repair. That Crown supervision might just be delaying my inevitable elimination when I prove incapable of evolution. Isla looked at him with an expression that cycled through emotions too complex to name. Then she did something that surprised him completely. She kissed him. Not violently, not with the desperate intensity of their previous encounters. Just gentle acknowledgement that they were both present and trying despite having no guarantee any of this would work. When she pulled back, tears tracked down her face despite her expression remaining controlled. I can't promise this works, Kedrick. I can't promise you're capable of the kind of fundamental change that prevents you from reverting to maximum violence every time someone threatens what matters. And I can't promise I'm strong enough to stay beside you through whatever comes next. She took his hand, her grip steady despite the tremor in her voice. But I can promise I'm not leaving today. Not after everything. Not after watching you choose survival over sovereignty. Not after you admitted you're terrified instead of pretending invulnerability. So we try. However that looks, whatever it costs. And maybe we fail and prove everyone right about damaged people being beyond salvation. But at least we'll fail together instead of you dying alone in this fortress wondering if connection was ever possible. Kedrick felt something crack inside him. Not the catastrophic collapse of something under pressure, but the slow fracture of armor that had protected him for so long, it had forgotten how to let anything through. I don't know how to do this, he admitted quietly, his voice rough with emotions he'd spent 43 years suppressing. I don't know how to care about someone without turning it into conquest. I don't know how to protect without possessing. And I don't know how to admit I need help without feeling like I'm betraying everything my father taught me about power requiring absolute self-sufficiency. Then we learn together, Isla responded, because I don't know how to love someone this damaged without becoming complicit in their self-destruction. I don't know how to support evolution without enabling the same patterns we're trying to escape. And I don't know how to stay beside someone capable of murdering 200 people without losing whatever moral framework I've maintained. She leaned against him, exhaustion evident in every line of her posture. So we're both confused, both terrified, and both committed to trying despite having no idea if any of this is sustainable. Welcome to actual human connection, Your Grace. It's exactly as catastrophic as you always feared. They stood together in the command center while Thornhaven settled into its new reality. A fortress under Crown supervision, ruled by a duke who'd chosen survival over absolute authority, maintained by a woman who'd decided damaged people were worth the impossible effort of salvaging. Outside, Crown forces established permanent presence. Inside, two people who'd spent their lives building armor began the slow process of learning how to survive without it. The weeks that followed felt like dying and being rebuilt simultaneously. Kedrick operated under Crown supervision that ranged from minimal interference to comprehensive oversight, depending on what actions he attempted. Every enforcement decision required documentation. Every use of security forces demanded justification. Every interaction with other aristocratic families was monitored for signs he was reverting to unsupervised brutality. It was humiliating, constraining, and absolutely necessary. Because left to his own devices, Kedrick recognized he would have immediately reverted to the patterns that had nearly gotten him executed, would have eliminated threats with overwhelming force, would have maintained control through fear and intimidation, would have proven that 43 years of systematic violence couldn't be undone through supervision and good intentions. But Crown oversight created external structure that forced him to pause before defaulting to elimination, created space between impulse and action, where he could consider whether violence was actually necessary or just habitual, created accountability that his internal moral framework had never provided. Isla remained beside him through the transition, her presence providing both support and constant reminder that his choices affected more than just tactical outcomes. She attended council meetings where he negotiated instead of threatened, witnessed enforcement actions where he chose restraint over elimination, observed countless moments where he wanted to revert to maximum violence and instead chose measured response because Crown supervision demanded it. Some days were better than others. Some days he made decisions that suggested evolution was possible. Some days he made decisions that suggested he was just better at hiding the monster. 3 months after Crown intervention, Caedric stood in his study watching sunrise over Thornhaven and recognizing that he'd survived longer under supervision than he'd expected. The territories remained stable, his position remained secure, and he remained alive despite having surrendered the absolute authority that had defined his existence. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like learning to breathe after spending 43 years holding his breath. Isla entered without knocking, carrying morning tea and the particular expression that suggested she had observations about his current psychological state. "You're brooding again. I can tell because you get this specific look when you're calculating whether accepting supervision was wisdom or just slower suicide." Caedric accepted the tea, grateful for her ability to identify his spirals before they became catastrophic. "Just thinking about how many people I've killed, how many families I destroyed, how much damage I deployed while convincing myself it was necessary for survival. And recognizing that Crown supervision didn't fix me. It just prevented me from making things worse while I figure out if there's anything left worth fixing." Isla moved to stand beside him at the window, her shoulder touching his in comfortable silence. "You want to know what I think?" "Always. I think you're expecting some dramatic transformation where you wake up one day completely different from who you were, where 43 years of systematic brutality just disappear because you've decided to be better." She turned to face him, her expression carrying hard-earned wisdom. "But that's not how this works, Caedric. You don't stop being the person your father built. You just learn to recognize when those instincts are leading you somewhere catastrophic and choose differently. Is that enough?" "I don't know, probably not. But it's what we have." She took his hand, her grip steady and present. "So we keep trying. We keep choosing measured responses over maximum violence. We keep accepting that evolution is messy and incomplete and never feels like enough. And we keep believing that damaged people are worth the impossible effort of salvaging, even when all evidence suggests otherwise." Caedric looked at her, really looked at her. Not through tactical lens, but at the actual human being who decided he was worth fighting for, despite knowing exactly what he was capable of. "Why?" he asked quietly. "Why stay? Why commit to this when you could have left dozens of times and built a life somewhere I couldn't destroy?" Isla smiled, exhausted and genuine. "Because I'm just as damaged as you are, Caedric, just better at hiding it. Because I spent my life building armor, and you're the first person who saw through it. And because watching you try to be better than your worst instincts makes me believe I might be capable of the same thing." She kissed him gently, acknowledgement rather than passion. "Also because I love you, which is probably the most catastrophic decision I've ever made, but apparently I'm committed to it now." Caedric felt something shift inside him, not the dramatic transformation he'd been expecting, but slow recognition that survival meant accepting he'd never be completely different from who he'd been. That evolution wasn't becoming someone new, but learning to choose differently when old instincts demanded violence. That love wasn't redemption, but companionship, through the impossible work of becoming marginally less catastrophic. "I love you too," he said quietly, "which terrifies me because I still don't entirely know the difference between loving someone and claiming them. But I'm trying to learn." "That's enough," Isla responded. "For now, that's enough." They stood together watching sunrise over Thornhaven, two damaged people learning to survive without the armor that had protected and isolated them for so long. Outside, Crown forces maintained supervision. Inside, evolution continued its messy, incomplete, absolutely necessary work. And somewhere in the slow accumulation of choices that prioritized connection over conquest, protection over possession, survival over sovereignty, Duke Caedric Ashford began learning what it meant to be human instead of just predator in expensive clothing. It wasn't redemption, it wasn't transformation, it wasn't any of the dramatic narrative arcs that stories promised. It was just two people choosing each other repeatedly, despite knowing exactly how catastrophic that choice could become. And somehow, impossibly, that was enough. 6 months after Crown intervention, Caedric received formal evaluation from Commander Martin. She arrived without military escort, suggesting this was assessment rather than sanction. They met in his study where he'd once pressed loaded pistol against his temple, wondering what the point was of surviving alone. "Duke Ashford," Commander Martin began, her expression professionally neutral. "The Crown has been monitoring your activities under supervision. We've reviewed enforcement decisions, political negotiations, and personal conduct over 6 months. And we've reached conclusions about your continued viability as territorial administrator." Kaedric maintained composure despite the fact that his survival depended entirely on whatever assessment followed. "Go ahead. You've demonstrated measurable behavioral change, reduced violence, increased negotiation, willingness to accept external oversight. These changes suggest that supervision has been effective in constraining your more catastrophic instincts." She paused, and Kaedric recognized the particular silence that preceded important qualification. "However, recent intelligence suggests you're still capable of reverting to maximum violence under sufficient provocation. You've made threats against families who've challenged your authority. You've deployed security forces in ways that push boundaries of acceptable enforcement. And you've demonstrated that supervision constrains but doesn't fundamentally alter your operational instincts. So the assessment is that I'm managing symptoms without addressing underlying pathology," Kaedric said flatly. "The assessment is that you're trying," Commander Martin corrected, "which is more than most people in your position would do. The Crown has decided to continue supervision indefinitely. You maintain your position and your territories, but you remain under permanent oversight. Any significant violation results in immediate sanction. Understood?" "Understood." Commander Martin stood, preparing to leave. "One more thing, Duke Ashford. The Crown isn't interested in perfection. We're interested in sustainability. You don't need to become someone completely different. You just need to maintain enough control that your brutality doesn't destabilize the territories you govern." She moved toward the door, then paused. "And for what it's worth, the fact that you've survived 6 months under supervision suggests you're more capable of evolution than you believe. Don't waste that by reverting to the monster your father built the moment oversight relaxes." After she left, Kaedric sat alone in his study, processing the reality that his life would be permanently supervised, that he'd never again operate with absolute authority, that survival meant accepting external constraints on instincts he'd cultivated for 43 years. It should have felt like defeat. Instead, it felt like permission to keep breathing. Isla found him an hour later, recognizing immediately that something had shifted. "The Crown? The Crown." Kaedric pulled her close, grateful for her solid presence. "Permanent supervision, indefinite oversight. They've decided I'm worth monitoring but never trusting completely." "And how do you feel about that?" Kaedric considered the question with the brutal honesty he'd learned over 6 months of trying to be someone marginally less catastrophic. "I feel like I've been given a life sentence that feels like mercy, like I've traded sovereignty for survival, and I'm still figuring out whether that's wisdom or just cowardice with better marketing." He looked at her directly, letting her see the exhaustion and self-awareness that supervision had forced him to develop. "But mostly I feel grateful. That I'm alive, that you stayed, that I have time to keep trying, even if trying never feels like enough." "Is that pathetic?" "It's human," Isla responded, "which is probably the most accurate assessment you've made about yourself in 43 years. They stood together in the study where his father had died and where he'd nearly followed, learning to survive in the space between who they'd been and who they were trying to become. Outside, Thornhaven continued its operations under Crown supervision. Inside, 2 damaged people maintained their impossible commitment to each other, despite knowing exactly how catastrophic that choice could become. And somewhere in the slow accumulation of choices that prioritize connection over conquest, survival over sovereignty, evolution over stagnation, Duke Kaedric Ashford learned the most important lesson his father had never taught him. That power wasn't about absolute control. That strength wasn't about eliminating vulnerability. That survival wasn't about being invulnerable. It was about finding someone worth being vulnerable for and choosing them repeatedly, even when every instinct screamed that attachment was just another word for weakness. It was about accepting that damaged people could still build something worth protecting, even if that thing was just each other. It was about learning that love wasn't redemption or transformation or any of the dramatic promises that stories offered. It was just 2 people deciding that trying together was better than dying alone. And somehow, impossibly, miraculously, that was enough. Years later, when historians documented Duke Kaedric Ashford's reign, They focused on the violence and the brutality and the systematic elimination of enemies that had characterized his rule. They noted the crown intervention that had curtailed his authority and the permanent supervision that had defined his later years. But they missed the most important part of the story. They missed the woman who'd seen past his carefully constructed defenses and decided he was worth salvaging. They missed the choice he'd made to accept supervision instead of death. They missed the slow, messy, incomplete evolution from predator to person. They missed the recognition that survival meant accepting you'd never be completely different from who you'd been, just capable of choosing differently when old instincts demanded violence. They missed the love story that happened in the spaces between conquest and connection, between power and vulnerability, between the monster he'd been built to be and the human he'd learned to become. But Kaedric and Isla knew. They knew that every day was choice between reverting to maximum violence or choosing measured response. They knew that evolution was never complete, never perfect, never enough. They knew that damaged people loving each other was simultaneously the most catastrophic and most necessary thing they'd ever done. And they knew that sometimes the strongest thing you could do wasn't eliminating threats or maintaining absolute control or proving you were invulnerable. Sometimes the strongest thing you could do was admitting you needed help, accepting supervision, and choosing survival over sovereignty. Sometimes the strongest thing you could do was letting someone see you as human instead of just predator. Sometimes the strongest thing you could do was choosing love, even when love felt like weakness. Choosing connection, even when connection felt like vulnerability. Choosing to try even when trying felt like dying slowly. And that choice, that impossible, catastrophic, absolutely necessary choice, made all the difference. In the end, Duke Kaedric Ashford didn't become the man his father had tried to build. He became something infinitely more dangerous and infinitely more human. He became someone capable of choosing connection over conquest. Someone capable of accepting that damaged people were worth salvaging. Someone capable of recognizing that the point of surviving wasn't maintaining absolute control, but finding something worth protecting beyond your own invulnerability. And if that evolution was incomplete, messy, and never entirely successful, at least it was evolution. At least it was trying. At least it was choosing to be marginally less catastrophic each day, even when every instinct screamed otherwise. And in a world built on power and possession and systematic violence, choosing to be marginally less catastrophic was the closest thing to redemption anyone like him would ever find. So Kaedric and Isla continued their impossible work of loving each other through the mess of evolution, supported by crown supervision and sustained by the recognition that trying was better than surrender. And somewhere in the slow accumulation of choices that prioritized survival over sovereignty, they built something neither had expected. Not perfection, not transformation, not redemption, just two damaged people learning to be human together. And somehow, impossibly, that was enough. That was always enough. That would always be enough.